Hello, Silas here. I'm back for another conversation with my friend Steven. You can say what's up, Steven.
Hello, everyone.
What are we going to be talking about today? It's another essay by Herbert Marcuse. We just had a conversation. I think it was the last conversation. Might have been something before that. I don't know. There might have been something before that, but we had a conversation where Stephen had already read Repressive Tolerance, and I did a reading of Repressive Tolerance and took some notes from it, and we had a conversation about that. And with us being interested in Herbert Marcuse, we've been kind of wondering what other things that has he written that have inspired and affected the current ideologies that are going on in the world right now that have a lot of influence. So to that end, Stephen found another essay by him. This one's a bit longer than Repressive Tolerance, and there'll be a link below to it. And he's taken some notes for it, and we're going to have a discussion of it. So, Stephen, can you tell us a bit about the essay?
Sure. So this essay was written in 1969. It's called An Essay on Liberation. It's interesting because this was written after Repressive Tolerance, after Eros and Civilization. That was the book dealing with Freudianism, trying to tie it with Marxism. And then there was One Dimensional Man, which talked about, I guess, what today would be called crass consumerism, the idea that, oh, people just want to make money, spend, and they don't really have depth beyond that. So this is sort of drawing from all those things, but in 1969, after the riots that happened both in the US and in France, and which it could be argued he had an impact on those because some of the ideas he was espousing led to those. And he was sort of reflecting on, okay, where do we go from here as far as the culture in terms of liberating the people from capitalism, to use his phrasing.
Yeah, and with this, I was interested when I read Repressive Tolerance. Some of the parts I was agreeing, like some of the things he was saying, and Marcuse seemed to be. He's definitely a rather intelligent man. He was very observant,
Yeah.
but he was living in a different time. So
Yeah.
not only is it's not even a situation where the way we talk about things, the way we see things, it's a language, it's the way we communicate things. It's not 100% what reality actually
Yeah.
is. You know, even Stephen and I are having this talk, we're doing it over different technology, we're in different locations, different continents, different times, but we're
Right.
talking about a similar topic. If we were sitting right next to each other, and we had read the same book, we would still have picked out different parts of it, read it at different times, had different
Mhm.
things in our lived experiences that called back to this. So even if you have a time when you can get everyone in the world to quote unquote experience everything in the same way at the same time, and everyone has seen the same things, heard the same things in a language that they can actually understand and see, there's still their own personal experiences. Still, the simple thing that even if two twins are sitting there experiencing something, one of them is standing right here, the other one is standing right there, and just that little difference might make them see something that wasn't happening to the other person. So with Mercouza, we're kind of thinking with some of the things in Repressive Tolerance, I was thinking, what if he had more information? What if he found
Yeah.
out that, hey, maybe what's happening in Russia was actually horrible? Let's say he had found out about the Holodomor. Would he still have written in the same way about those places? If he found out about the actual death toll and the Great Leap Forward, would he have written the same things about that? And would he have, if he actually found out about the amount of actual human flourishing in comparison to more accurate understanding of how horrific history has actually been, and in reality, it was just he was living in a time when people were starting to actually report things a lot more accurately, and horrific things, bad things, harm sticks out more than the positives. So it was a lot more common coming out of the World War II situation to see all the suffering that was happening in humanity and have that more mythical kind of idea of what history was. And with history, the people who were writing history were the people who were living the best of the life in history. You weren't hearing about majority of the peasants, majority of the people that were just illiterate, that never actually, that were pretty much living like apes, like just our ape cousins in the woods, like just barely out of the Bronze Age type of thing, just below Bronze Age in some situations. They didn't write books. When you heard about the Victorian age, most of the stuff you were hearing about were the people living in the manors. You weren't hearing about 99% of the population that was living 40 people in a building. Right? It wasn't 40 people, but they had the situation where it's like a room. They had curtains and sheets, kind of multiple families in there,
Yeah.
parents having intercourse with the kids just sitting there, like
Yeah.
people in a mess, men and women just living together in different situations, all going to factories, no real wage gap difference or work death gap difference because it was the kids, the family, everybody
Yeah.
was in the factory. Like those are not the people that you hear about.
Yeah.
So we hear about the queens, the kings, and we think that's how people were back then. Things were more in a state of nature. People were happier. It's like, no, no, no. Things were a lot more horrific back then. So I was thinking with this, I think it's a positive thing to see that this is something that came after repressive tolerance. So we're going to try and see, I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing if there's some things where he's like, okay, he's learned something different and now this is kind of a little change in how he wrote in repressive tolerance. I'm not counting on it because there might be some other things involved in there, but I'm interested to see.
Well, I wanted to make a few comments. So in addition to this, I also watched 2 interviews with Marcuse towards the end of his life. One was in the mid-70s. The other was in 79, actually, the year he died. I think he died like 3 months after this last interview. And
Oh, wow.
it's interesting because he was a Marxist to the end, because they said, are you a Marxist? He said, yes, I understand that people don't like that term, and I disagree with a lot of people who would identify as this. Now, in fairness to him, my understanding is he did denounce what happened in the Soviet Union, but then somebody said, like, why do you still believe in Marxism after this? And he laughed and said, because it's right. So he had a very religious fervor on this belief system. And I haven't read it, but I watched Matt Taibbi, who we discussed in the Substack video. He debated someone on Marcuse. He also wrote that piece on him, and he said that, I guess in One Dimensional Man, Marcuse talks about how he actually went to an auto factory and talked to the workers there, because that's one of the criticisms of Marx, which I and others have made, is that as far as we know, Marx never set foot in a factory. He read about factories from a book that Engels had written, and they said Engels, some of it was fake and some of it was out of date. So it's like, Marx wasn't even having good source materials, but Marcuse actually went to an auto plant and decided to talk to workers. And I guess one of his inspirations in One Dimensional Man was, he talked about the whole idea of false consciousness, and he went to these auto workers and he's like, are you guys happy? Don't you want a better life? And I guess, remember, this is in the 60s and 70s, of living standards were continuing to improve. And they basically said, like, look, we don't have a perfect life, but overall things are pretty good. We don't see a need to tear down the system. And this sort of shows the split in Marxism between the intellectuals and the workers, because the idea was in classical Marxism is that, the workers figure out things are bad, wake up and destroy the system. But then, of course, it's like, for some reason they're not waking up. And the Marxists would say, well, they have false consciousness. They've been brainwashed into thinking they're better than they are. But, I and others would argue, no, they're just happy with their lives. So as long as they benefit from the status quo, at least to a point, they're not going to tear things down. But I think Marcuse saw it as like somehow it was his duty to wake people up and help overthrow the system. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that it's depending on projecting people's values onto other people. Where somebody might have an ideology, or someone might think, I know this God, and this God is the way to eternal good. So it's up to me, it's a calling for me to make sure everybody else sees this. It's that kind of bit of a white man's burden. It's a bit of the things that goes behind the missionaries, where the missionaries feel like, yes, you might seem to be okay in your village and you've been living in this culture for millennia, and you might think you're okay, but no, because I know the actual things that are better than that, this high level of goodness, that it would be a failing on my part in order to not tell you about this thing and convince you that what you've been doing is wrong. And they will be able to find certain things and say, okay, that can improve in something. But that other person, if they could study your life, they might have some things and they say, there's something in your life. This whole idea, we were just talking about this earlier before we started recording, talking about this whole lived experience type of things, or this living wage type of thing. It's like people make those decisions of how they want to live in certain places. If you're not actually dying, and my channel's name is Dying Alive, so it's kind of a thing like the opposite of the living dead, the zombies thing, where if you just sit and do nothing, you're technically dying. But whenever you actually do something, you're actually living. What you're doing is enabling your living. So depending on the kind of quality of life that you want, it's going to affect certain things. Like one thing here recording this from Nairobi, Kenya, is you see the massive slums. There's multiple very big slums here in Nairobi, Kenya. The world's biggest slum, I think one of them, still the world's biggest slum, Kibera slums. It's about 1 million people in there. And when we're talking about slums, some of the places, it's definitely improved a lot, even just over the time, last 10 years, last 20 years, my lifetime, compared to how it was before. But you still see some places where there's like corrugated metal homes, like there's still like people getting power lines, this jacking power lines from the different power cables going on, open sewage, trash. That stuff's being cleaned up slowly by slowly and surely. And now they're getting more stable things. But there used to be just a regular thing of fires coming through, burning the places down, people living in squalor and situations like that. But oddly enough, this could be also because of the testing. With the current pandemic, it didn't really come in and wipe people out in a different sense. But there's other things that would go there, cholera, other kind of, if somebody gets injured, somebody gets assaulted, some of the structures aren't there. But a lot of those people come from the village. And in the different village ancestral lands, they normally come from families where they leave plots of land there. They could actually be living there. But back there, now you're talking about Kenya, I think, is 35% or so electrified. So you still have places like the villages where my parents lived and grew up just recently, a few years ago, finally got electricity to their main homesteads.
Wow.
So you're talking, those people live that, they leave that. It's still land, it's still some security. They could work off the land, they could farm, they have the community there. People speak the same language they speak. It's a long history. They have relatives and things like that. Now, going into the quality of life, there's things in there with the type of parenting, the different possibilities and the hopes and the dreams, but they still decide, a lot of these people decide to leave that life, state of nature, where people say, oh, we're not dealing with racism, we're not dealing with all this technology, we're living off of the earth, everything organic, this and this. Like that kind of situation, they leave that to come to live in a slum because there's a chance that they feel, okay, if I'm in this place, maybe my kid can go to some school in this area and then they can get into college and they can have this, or they can personally get a job. And even with those low income jobs where they're making maybe $5 a day, if that, or $5 a week in some cases, in some people, they still have enough to somehow send some money back to the village and have some things coming up in there. So these kind of situations, but why are those people deciding to leave that kind of environment to live in a slum in Nairobi, in the kind of situation where your average Westerner lives in, like the quality of life gap between those two people is bigger than it's ever been, than it was for majority of history when you're talking about kings versus the lowest of the peasants, like for the majority of history. But that's what they choose to do. But it's something that I cannot imagine doing that. Like it's like, to me, going to the slum, I can't imagine that, but I can imagine more going to the village. So that's kind of just different understandings. And I think just a long way to say, with Marcuse, what is it about Marcuse's mindset that he could go and he saw those people and he wasn't able to break that understanding and see that these people actually had a previous life that was so different, that the life that he thinks was squalor and horrific for them due to their lived experiences and their points of views, that was actually a big step up from what they actually had in their whole value system and their whole point of view in the world and things like that. Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say, in one of those interviews, he talks about the tension between the intellectuals and the workers, like the whole idea of, oh, the intellectuals, they sometimes see themselves as better than the workers. And you kind of get that theme in his writings, the idea that we're supposed to be uplifting the workers, but at the same time, we kind of look down on them. Like, he doesn't say that explicitly, but you kind of get that vibe. And then the workers in turn look at the intellectuals and are like, wait a minute, we're out here physically doing things, sweating. You're just writing up theories in a book. Why should you deserve credit? So there's sort of that tension. And I think this is where he talks about it in this essay we'll get into, but he talks about this is why they reached out to minorities. I think he talks, I forget here, one of the works, he talks about the disabled, things like that. And that sort of foreshadowed disability studies, intersectionality, things like that. Because the idea of, well, if the workers aren't waking up to these ideas, who can we wake up to these ideas? And I think, well, the way I like to explain the false consciousness thing to people who aren't as familiar, that I explain that, think of the Joe Sixpack stereotype, like the guy who works a blue collar job, either goes home, sits in front of his TV with beer, goes to a sports bar, cheers on a team with his friends, goes to sleep, does it over the next day. To some people, that's what life is. That's enjoyable. But I think people like Marcuse, very intelligent, very high-minded intellectuals, they look down on that. They're like, how can anyone find that fun? And then I had mentioned in a previous discussion, Theodore Adorno spent a lot of time critiquing popular culture, especially jazz music. And there's sort of this contempt. Oh, the masses enjoy this. I really, I wish they would appreciate the high-minded culture. And look, I mean, you liked my recent post, Two Steps from Hell. That's one of my favorite groups as far as music. And like, I wish people would listen to and appreciate music like that. But I don't feel it's my duty to somehow get everyone to listen to that. If the masses want to go out and listen to Cardi B, that's their choice. I don't feel like somehow I should wake people up and get them to appreciate this other music, and then they'll become enlightened, or that seems to be their attitude.
Yeah, and I think that to me is what makes some of this seem to be rather religious rather than just something that they do, and I
Yeah.
think this was something that you saw really big in like the gaming community when some of this ideology started going into that environment. And
Yeah.
I like just occasionally jumping into these different rabbit holes of internet information rabbit holes. Recently, I got into a rabbit hole of climbing, just like people who
Yeah.
just do the different climbing type of things, like bouldering, different kind of things, like finding the
Yeah.
different communities and cultures that do that. You'll find some YouTube channels, like millions of people just, but it's like the people who are interested in climbing in the world, it's maybe a million people tops.
Yeah.
But all those million people just watch these few channels over and over again and get information from them that these people make a living from it. I
Yeah.
got into the StarCraft community, which is a game that I used to
Uh,
enjoy playing just completely just as a side thing. And I just playing like I like playing the story mode and just going through just the typical thing. Like I won't actually use any strategy. I'll just go and like, okay, just build up as many things. Oh, I like the mechs, so I'll have to get as many mechs. But you go into the competitive StarCraft, and these people have been playing. Some of the people, I think I mentioned this maybe in a previous conversation. Some of the people have been playing for their entire life. Some of the people have been
yeah.
like 13 when they started playing, and that was back in like 2008 in the StarCraft 1 or when StarCraft 2 came out. And
Yeah.
now they're professionals and they've been playing, and they just play. They wake up in the morning, they play StarCraft for like 8 hours. They go to sleep. They wake up in the morning, they play StarCraft for 8 hours. They go to sleep, and they have it down to different techniques, and they know like on the screen they know this character has a shooting range of this, so they do it in that point. They know how to time it down, like they have to do like this build order, so when they have an
Yeah.
upgrade coming, they send characters across the screen. They know like it's going to take 30 seconds to walk a
Yeah.
character across the screen to get
Yeah.
to the location, and by the time like 2 seconds before they hit the location, the upgrade will hit, and then my characters will now be higher power than the characters that they've built. And it's like it's next level kind of chess with all these
Yeah.
different things going on, the moves per minute type of thing. And some of these people are making, like I just saw somebody who was just in a StarCraft tournament, and yeah, it was a final match of it, but he just made 60,000 playing StarCraft for like an hour. But the amount of time he'd put into that to get to that point, the amount of people investing in that, the amount of actual advertising that comes, the people that watch that stuff, the computers, the rigs, the people invested, all these other things around that to make that point. But why should I go to that person and say, "Oh man, you should really read Marcuse"?
Yeah.
Like you're wasting your time playing StarCraft. Like you really need to read this essay by Marcuse because it's really important for your life. You're like, no, it's not. Like, so, so I get people have their different things and they find a way to make a living and have their existence. But one thing that I like about those communities is people can get into something and get deeply into it, even if I'm not a fan of it, and they enjoy it and they get
Yeah.
something out of it. What I don't get about the people, that's why I'm saying it's religious, is the need to have everybody else accept it. The
Yeah.
victimology type of things, where it's like literally they seem to be getting some joy out of being harmed, out of being handicapped, out of being the lower type of person, maybe to get help, and then they want other people to accept and believe like they do. And that's the weird part about it that I don't necessarily get. And I think Marcuse still has some of in that. And I guess for some of that, that may be part of why I'm making the content that I make, because I want more people to actually get some of the things that I think about and share it out there. But I think it's more for me to put this stuff out there, and if somebody else sees it and they accept it and they agree with it, they can interact with it. But I don't feel like preaching to people. It's weird. I don't feel like converting people as much as I think some of these people seem to be
Yeah.
engaged in doing. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, yeah, and James Lindsay has talked about that's why the solution for this is to treat this stuff like a religion, because he made the point that it was a controversy when he was younger, because of course he grew up, I guess, Tennessee, Bible Belt and all that. And he talked about how there was a very religious teacher in school, and she got into trouble because she would try to espouse her beliefs in the classroom. And they were saying, like, look, legally, you can't do this. Now, I guess this woman was ancient, had been teaching forever. Eventually, I guess she just retired, like out of the system on her own. But he was saying we have to treat the social justice scholarship the same way. Like with this woman, like you can be the most religious fanatic on the planet, but if you keep it out of the classroom, fine. Like I would prefer that. I would prefer you go to church every day, you pray all the time, you don't bring it into the class. That's fine by me. But the moment you feel it's your duty to espouse these beliefs and to change people's minds and all this, and this is the issue with the social justice stuff, they say, oh, this is just an issue of morality, it's not about politics. Well, no, it's a religion you're trying to impose upon other people, and then that gets into issues of, okay, do you have a right to do this? Are you going to punish people for disagreeing? And then are you really educating kids? Or are you just proselytizing? And I think you know, he's been pushing for that. I think he talked about writing a book on this, but the idea of we have to treat this stuff like a religion, and then if the moment people are espousing this in school, say, look, you're going to get fired if you keep doing this. And I think if you fire a few of these people, like he says, that'll make some examples.
Yeah, and yeah. I think with religions, the kind of lives that we live right now, most your average Christian, your average Jewish person, your average Muslim, they aren't really that familiar with the dogma, with the actual content, with the actual origins of the systems that they live in. And then a lot of the things they consider positive from those systems were adopted and not actually part of the initial content. So I think one thing we're trying to parse out and make an understanding of the importance of, if you're somebody who's come to this and like, oh, you have some interest in Marcuse and you're starting to see where he kind of stands in this. I think we had agreed that he's more somebody who inspired critical theory. He's one of the people who's set down some of the basic ideologies from the founding content for that critical theory is based on. And then after that, postmodernism came up. So we're thinking, if you look at the three Abrahamic religions, critical theory is Judaism, and then you have critical theory was Judaism, and then postmodernism is the equivalent of Christianity that came after, that has some relations to it, but has changed some things around rather massively, like in the different sense. Even critical theory, I think you look at with Judaism, the way Judaism is practiced, it's more like insular, where it's like, oh, where the tribe, as three parentheses, we're a tribe, we're in there. If you come to critical theory, you're part of the selected, you're part of the people in there. But then I think when it comes to postmodernism, it's more active in society. It's more like, okay, action out there, missionaries and things. I think you look at the postmodernism, the whole iteration with suffering in there. I think with Christianity, there is some kind of equivalent with that, where Jesus died for our sins and the cross and that kind of situation where we're eternally sinful, where that original type of sin type of thing is in there. And then we have to pray to the God. We have to follow the religion in order to actually find the salvation. That's kind of something that I think with postmodernism, with the progressive stack and things like that. Now you have the different denominations within the critical theory is just critical theory in general. I know we had a long discussion on that, and we started looking at the different ones. But those different parts of critical theory, I think once we started talking about those different aspects of it, that was after postmodernism. So I think postmodernism has a lot of influence in critical race theory, in queer studies, in gender studies, and things like that. So that's when you go into denominations and things like that. Postmodernism with Catholicism, then all these offshoots, so like the Protestantism type of thing. And then now what we're seeing with the regressives right now, I saw somebody just recently tweet, like they were like, oh, I thought these activists, these extreme regressives were going to stop after Biden got in, but it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. I just asked the person, I was like, why, if you actually define them as extremists, why would you think they would actually settle down after a politics as usual type of person came in, and Kamala Harris, who was this really not liked by the people in general? Why would you think that would assuage him? And I think they're kind of the equivalent with Islam, and more the fundamentalist type of groups of them, and they're the youngest of that kind of ideology, that way of looking at the world and things like that, trying to understand things, trying to structure things, and they've borrowed different parts of it, but they're a lot more activist in it, and they make a lot more declarative things where it's like, no, this is the way it is, and it has to be this way, and we have to do it in this kind of way. We have certain real big divisions between the people. These are good people, and these people cannot be helped. Those are bad people, and those people cannot be helped. And those people cannot come together. These people have to come to, if they're going to work with us, they have to work with us entirely on our standards, yet they can never actually be like us, the kind of way they have in some of the Islamic teaching. They say, like, okay, there's people of the book who, as long as you accept certain things in the book, you can be part of us, but still not going to be on the same level as us. There's still a kind of a caste system type of things in there. So I was thinking that's kind of how to look at this. I think it's helpful to me to try and look at it that way. It might be helpful to somebody else out there. If you, Stephen, or anybody else can think of a better kind of way to explain where Marcuse kind of stands in this kind of ideology type of thing, I think I'll be glad to hear it.
Well, I was just going to make some commentary. Silas and I discussed this a bit before it started. The comparison I was thinking of too, they talk about Neoplatonism. For those who don't know, that started, it was sort of towards the end of Roman times, it went on to influence Christianity. And obviously, you can tell by the name, it was influenced by Plato, but it drew from Aristotle as well. Now, when Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay were writing Cynical Theories, they were debating this, which has more sway, postmodernism or critical theory. And I think Helen sided more with postmodernism. James was critical theory. So what they agreed upon was that the two fused together. They drew from each. And that made me think of Neoplatonism, because the idea was it drew heavily from Plato, like critical race theory drew heavily from critical theory, but Crenshaw also cites postmodernism, so it draws from the other as well. And they tried to combine and integrate aspects of both. And that became its own ideology, obviously targeting issues such as race, gender, disability, all the things we talked about in that series. And to sort of add on to your point about Islam, I always think of how that people have said that ISIS has said we're the people interpreting the Quran correctly. The moderate Muslims are the heretics. Because if you read the Quran directly, it has a lot of violence and things in it. It does have good things too, like the Bible, but there is a lot of violence as well. So they're taking it very literally. It didn't go through the Reformation period Judaism's been around for so long, and Christianity, of course, broke apart and went through different reformations and things. But Islam hasn't done this. And with some of the social justice stuff, I think it's still that very young sort of fanatical fervor of the converted kind of effect, where it's, okay, we have to take this as literally as possible, spread it to everything, it can't be questioned, and we'll destroy anyone who doesn't go along with it. That may sound hyperbolic, but that seems to be what they've been doing.
Yeah, and it's destroying a different kind of play. We're working on a different it's all wars all wars have been, are, and will be cultural. Yeah. So when you have that kind of situation, now that the wars are there, now the actual field of war, the sphere of wars, those change. I don't think, when I'm saying destroy, yes, they might destroy someone's career, or they might shame somebody, they might cancel people, but it's not destroy. Yes, there are people who actually end up getting killed, and we've seen some recent shootings and things like that in the United States of America, and even just the rest of the world. Some of these same ideas and thoughts lead to actual deaths, but that has plummeted. The amount of actual physical violence and death and things like that has plummeted, and I'm thankful for that. But there's still very significant battles being waged on more of a mental sphere, more of a socio-political sphere, which are important because those things can fray and go into it. And you're making an excellent position and point with it, talking about with the Muslims, and I agree with the Muslims on that. And I think one of the difference with things like with Christianity and Judaism, I'm not as well versed into it, but Judaism seems to be something where you're constantly, it seems to be constantly being updated. Like they have massive groups of people where they just sit there and spend their whole time studying the Torah and changing it. It seems more of a living document than even the Bible. The Bible seems to be more of a thing where they said, okay, it's not a living document, but we're going to adjust it. This is what they meant in that time, and this is what we think they mean if they knew this information now. Part of that was through the Vicar of Christ. He was supposedly being able to actually get information from God about how the Bible should be interpreted at this point. Now that's different with the Protestants and things like that. They also went into different things. Yeah. So their fundamentalists are now working on content. The fundamentals that they work on has changed in the actual translation. They say, yes, in the past we meant this, but we were wrong about that. The Bible was right, but we were wrong about how we read it. So we're going to change it to this way. So now, from now on, if you're talking about the fundamentals, this is what the fundamentals mean. With Islam, since the content itself can't be changed, the content itself is being considered perfect, the fundamentalists will actually demand, like, you can't have change. So those are the people in all these religions, these faiths, the fundamentalists, by definition, are the ones dealing with the fundamentals. If you're a moderate, if you're not dealing with actual stuff, you're the one who's actually further away from the actual faith. That's just the way thing is. That's just the way words work. This is the reality of the matter.
And also, to add on to the religious dimension with this stuff, this shows why separation of church and state came into being, why it's so important, because the founders understood that what happened in Europe, especially in the 16th century or so, that once Luther had his Reformation, the church split in all these different factions, especially in Germany. All these different religions tried to get control of the government because they wanted to impose the religion on everyone. So that led to all these civil wars, these different groups fighting to try and get the government, use it to impose itself and stamp out opposition. You had you had Catholics in England for a while. Of course, Protestantism eventually took over. You had France. We say Huguenots, it's probably like Huguenot. Protestants there tried to take over. They didn't succeed. Austria went back and forth all this. So it's the idea of, okay, don't give any religion control of the government because they're going to try and do that. And in social justice, I would argue, has to be viewed in the same way, because if you give them the power to do what they want, it's going to be what did James Lindsay say? Leninism 4.0. It's going to be where the philosopher kings were going to decide what everyone is doing, and that leads us to a very dark place.
Yeah. Just as you were mentioning that, I was just thinking, this is probably doing a separate series or separate conversation. Just go on a tangent or break off and start seeing like what was happening in the Eastern phase. I was talking with a different friend about different epochs that were changing and different things, and how I think the biggest divide in the world before the current global civilization that we're living in right now wasn't actually Europe, or it was more East-West, where like the eastern part of the world, talking Asia, had very different roots than most of the Western world, which is actually including the Middle East, because the Abrahamic religions have influenced lots of places. And Africa, I guess you could say, was kind of like a dark continent where there wasn't really an establishment of too many things. That was a lot to do with the geography, that the places were still very tribal, and they hadn't really developed certain technologies and certain communities to the point where you needed the kind of social structures in order to have these myths about society, in order to keep society together as a positive thing. So that was a situation where it's more like tabula rasa and those kind of people. So it was like, okay, we're just going to adopt to the scene. And you still see that right now. Like you look at there's so many churches, like different, like we're talking about these different slums and things like that. On Sundays, you just walk around and people just have these little places open. It's like one church. It's a church of Sarsami, this. And it's just him. He's the only member of that branch of Christianity. And he has his flock of people that come there regularly, and that's his job. That's just what he does. That's who he is. He's the Pastor Sammy in that area. But nobody else knows that church everywhere. So it's like you kind of have the thing. It's like mixed in different parts. They read from the Bible. But it's like, what does that have to do with actually that? So you still have that kind of situation. But now with Asia, when you start talking about what are their myths, what are their religions, how do they adopt some of these ideas and things like that, what's happening in China is very interesting to me. The difference between Asia in general versus they're talking about what's happening in Asians in the United States of America, yet they're equating Asians, which is a term of a continent. It's more of a geography thing. When there's a difference between Asians and Orientals, I think the actual more accurate term to use with white and black would be Orientals. And I don't know what Orientals, and then the Southeast Asians, which are kind of different. The Southeast Asian, I mean the Orientals, and I have to think this through. Orientals are different from the Indians and the Sri Lankans and those kind of people, and the Pakistanis. Where do you actually go to the difference between the Middle East and Asia? Like, is Turkey's European, but would you consider them to be white people? Like, so that's this kind of question. So those are kind of things that I'm interested in looking into more, that we'll probably get into in a separate location. But I think to finish up before, I guess you will have some responses to this, but we should probably head to the actual reading is, with this thing, why I think this is important is because in that conversation, I was thinking about that saying, the West is the best. And the West isn't necessarily the best. That's not accurate enough, and probably do a separate video. I might get this as a clip as a separate thing. But the West isn't the best. Like, the more accurate, the more precise term, more precise phrase would be the West is the current result of the best. Like, the way the West is, and the West is mostly the United States of America, because people were leaving Europe for a long time. The best people were leaving Europe because they were frustrated with some of the things. Not necessarily the best, but a lot of people were leaving there. A lot of people from different parts in the world, partly due to the wars, partly due to different structures and limitations that they had in these places. There's countries that still have caste systems. Yeah. When you had that kind of situation, the people could actually leave. They left and came to the West, primarily the United States of America. And they started developing certain ideas and living in certain ways and living certain culture and working in a certain way. It was some of the best of humanity. Even right now, you look at many people who are the best of their cultures or their societies. They send their kids to the United States of America, even if we have an entire series of the Cracks of the Ivory Tower talking about how questionable that is with the schooling system. There's still positive things in there where there is something about that kind of ideology, that individualism, that enlightenment type of thing that has crystallized in what the United States of America is. And I think that is a better way of thinking, a better way of relating to the world. And that includes people like Marcuse. That includes the fact that Marcuse could come to the United States of America, leave Germany, and then he died in Germany from a heart attack. So he was back and forth and things like that. But still being part of the West, he could give these ideas, live in a situation where the ideas don't take control of the society to the point where me and Stephen are not allowed to have a conversation. Stephen and I, not allowed to have a conversation where we can actually talk about this as critically about this. And we're not living in China where it's like, if we were having this, we'd have been shut down. You wouldn't be able to hear it. We'd be disappeared in some kind of situation.
Yeah.
That is part of that enlightenment thing. That is part of the thing. So we'll be able to, we might be converted. By having this conversation, we might be converted and then find a way to convince people. Or by having this conversation, we might find a way that shows like, okay, this is something we should let go and convince other people who would let go. Yet you have a place where there's more limitations on that. And those people, whoever this happens to get power, will put their ideology in there and might crush other ideas and thoughts and ways of living that would benefit those people in power even better than the system that they think they have right now. And I think that kind of idea, that's why the West is the current result of the best ways humans have figured out how to live and approach reality. So I think that's going to increase. And I think learning about Marcuse, learning about his thoughts, and it's kind of the kind of person who I wish Marcuse was alive now to kind of see the things that we know now and see. I'd be very curious to see what he would say about some of the things now. And the people who've heard about Marcuse, who are living by some of the things he inspired, I would be interested to hear, what do you think about if you've never heard about some of these things that Stephen's about to be telling us about as we get into it. But yeah.
All right. That's all I had. I was just going to jump right in.
Okay.
As we discussed before this, I'm not going to read the whole essay. I mostly highlighted paragraphs that I thought were interesting or valuable. I wasn't really swayed by what I read. However, I thought it was good because it's important to read because it gives insight into what people who disagree with us are saying, where a lot of the current evangelical left, as they've been called, a lot of their ideas came from via Angela Davis, Crenshaw, or other people. You can see you'll as we get into this, you'll see certain themes that are commented today, and sort of the disillusionment with classical Marxism, and all right, where do we go from here, and all this. And I think it's good too, because I complain about people criticize people we like Ayn Rand and whoever, and they haven't actually read them. I feel it's important to actually read them and form our own opinions rather than just, oh, I heard bad things about this person from somebody somewhere. No, we should actually sit here and read it. And look, if they're right on some things, we'll acknowledge. If they're wrong, they're wrong. All right.
Yeah. And also suggestions below, as Stephen mentioned a few other ones. If you have heard or read any other content that you thought was good, let us know below. If there's shorter pieces, like with Repressive Tolerance, it was about an hour and a half. Some of these things, if it's short enough to read in an hour and a half, 2 hours, I'll probably do a reading of the actual thing when I find time. But this one is a lot longer of an article. I think it would have taken probably 4 hours at least to do the full reading. So that one we're going to preserve. We're still going to get to the actual human action, because if we're going to do something that big, I think I'd want to do something I'm also very into, and I think I want the rest of the world to know about. But we'll be taking time and taking suggestions for these smaller things that people may, we'd be interested to see what you think about this, and you can also let us know what you think about other things that Marcuse or other people have written and that you think would be interesting for us to know about. Let us know in the comment section. We'll welcome those. Yeah.
Sure. All right, so I'll jump right in. So it's called An Essay on Liberation by Herbert Marcuse, written in 1969. There's a preface, an introduction. There's 4 sections. First one is called A Biological Foundation for Socialism, ? Number 2 is The New Sensibility. Number 3 is Subverting Forces, - in Transition. And number 4 is Solidarity. So I'll start here.
Number 4 is Solidarity. What was number 3?
It's called Subverting Forces, and then it's a - and then In Transition.
Okay. There's going to be a link below to it as mentioned.
All right, so I'll start with the preface here. The growing opposition to the global dominion of corporate capitalism is confronted by the sustained power of this dominion, its economic and military hold in the 4 continents, its neocolonial power, and most important, its unshaken capacity to subject the majority of the underlying population to its overwhelming productivity and force. This global power keeps the socialist orbit on the defensive, all too costly not only in terms of military expenditures, but also in the perpetuation of a repressive bureaucracy. The development of socialism thus continues to be deflected from its original goals, and the competitive coexistence with the West generates values and aspirations for which the American standard of living serves as a model. The Great Refusal takes a variety of forms. Do you have any thoughts or comments on this?
Again, now this comes to the definitions of socialism.
Yeah.
If you're using the definitions, I like to use the definitions from Mises.org, and socialism and communism kind of related. It's just when there's more public control of the means of production, that kind of sense, when communism is a full on. But socialism, I think it is some private sector allowed in there, but it's supposed to serve it. And what we look, I've come to the realization that actually, some of the people on the political left were actually correct when they were calling the United States fascist. Because it actually is closer to fascist than it is to socialist. Definitely closer to fascist than it is to anything that I would define capitalist as, although this is a different definition of capitalism that was actually created like before it was Mises and Rothbard kind of took it and like changed it to more what mean like the anarcho-capitalist type of situation. But anyway, because it's a situation where the state is so massive and through regulation and different things has created certain monopolies that even if those monopolies aren't necessarily working directly with the state with a whole with a whole rotating door where it's like somebody works there and then they go into the private sector and they come back to the public sector, just like bouncing back and forth. You look at the connection with the media and things like that. Oh, this is a media of that party. This is a media of that party. And they just cover different. It's like the PR for the parties, that kind of situation where you look at, for example, the power industry. Who's involved in it? How can you actually get to the power industry? It's completely regulated and controlled by the government. Yes, the government itself doesn't own the power stations, but they're in a situation where they limit and they control who's going to be running the power stations, how you can actually interact with the people, where you can build those power stations. So in all intents and purposes, they are actually controlling the monopoly of the actual thing. So when you come to that point, that kind of is fascism. So it's like some neo-fascism type of thing. So I don't even understand. Like, this is one thing that was coming back again when we were talking about what would Marcuse say about the world today when we were reading Repressive Tolerance, when he was pointing out certain structures in the government, and he was saying, and I was asking people right now, I'm saying, that's what the political left is now.
Yeah.
That is what the Democrat Party is now. Like, if Marcuse was alive now, I can't see him considering himself a Democrat. Like, I just can't.
No.
Like, it seems like he would be railing against what the Democratic Party actually is today. So that's kind of just my thoughts on this. So I'd be concerned. I'd be wondering what does he mean by socialism here, and what does he think? What would he think about the structure going on right now?
Well, James Lindsay has said, because he read this essay recently, that's how I found out about it, that the goal here was to create a bureaucracy-free socialism. Now, how that would even come into being, I have no idea. Again, we'll read through the essay, let's give the devil his due, but it's like, obviously we could talk about the marginal utility. We'll get to that in human action. We could talk about the price calculation problem, but this idea that somehow this will spontaneously emerge and everyone will share everything. And I just, it's magic. It's like, it takes magic for this to happen. I don't see how. Yeah. Now, in fairness, he draws heavily on Freud, and I feel this is important because remember, Marxism was a blank slate philosophy, the idea that everything is just molded, everything's socially constructed, whereas Freud believed in repressed urges, trauma, all that. So he was sort of drawing from that and trying to combine it with Marxism. And to be clear, even though we call him a Marxist or neo-Marxist, he wasn't a pure Marxist. I mean, he had disagreements with Marx too, but he was trying to sort of marry some of these ideas and see if this is the road to socialism, as it were. All right.
Yeah, so. And some of those things are definitely right. Human beings have been very broken to come to the point where we are cognizant of some of the harm and the issues and what the good and the bad. It's like, I think when you beat a dog, you can tell there's the difference between a dog that has been raised in a nice, happy, kind environment versus a dog that has been raised to be a fighter, to be in a kennel and it's been abused. And people see that and they don't walk and expect those two dogs to think the same. But those two dogs aren't necessarily aware that the dog that's in that kind of fighting situation is not like, oh, I'm an abused dog, I should have been peacefully parented or peacefully petted. They don't have that concept. So they don't have an ability of repressing certain things, or, oh, there goes the dog that could have been me if I'd been peacefully petted. It's like, no, they don't have it. They're just the dog. But with humans, we have that ability to recognize that, hey, there's something really wrong. Like, I shouldn't be this way. This has happened. And then I see this other human have this thing happen to them. why do I react to it this way and that human reacts to it that way? And then you go to that religious aspect, like, oh, there might be something else out there. And I don't think we had identified the effect of peaceful parenting, the effect of how broken we've been as a species over time. So some of those things that he was coming, I think, was coming at the tail end of that, where we now have a lot more realizations about the real differences and the real positives and the real changes that humans can actually have. And I think that's something that's completely accurate there. Yeah.
And my understanding is that Freud, for all his errors, he did recognize certain things that were right, like the dangers of child abuse and all that. And that certainly is important. But at the same time, Freud himself was not very scientific. Again, well, Karl Popper, the idea of falsifiability, a lot of Freud's theories and ideas had to be taken on faith. They were true no matter what, like Marxism itself. And that's the irony of Marcuse using the paradox of tolerance to serve as the basis for repressive tolerance. But Popper himself was critical of Marxism, even the whole approach to history. He was critical of Freud, his whole approach to things too. Now, in fairness, you can be influenced by people and not agree with everything they said. But if Karl Popper went on, I forget how long he lived, but if he were to see Marcuse's things, I think he would have a lot of criticisms to make for sure.
Yeah. But like you said, it's the religious thing, it's the magic thing, because there was just certain things we just couldn't understand. Like, I don't know, like there's certain things, like how would you be able to explain a computer to somebody who hasn't even seen like an abacus before, who hasn't even understood the basic concept of math? Yeah. So it's kind of that kind of thing where it's like, there's so little that is actually known about the human condition, about sentience, about just existence, thought, that this is something I kind of asked somebody, could you convince, if somebody was unable to have an imagination, could you teach them to be imaginative? That's the kind of thing where it's like, is there something where it's like there's some things where are beyond knowing, so you just add in magic, because science and these things like that came from that. How many years did people spend trying to do like alchemy, where it's like turning iron into gold? Yeah. And in the future, we might be able to actually that lead into gold. Yeah. In the future, we might actually be able to do that. Yeah. By actually moving different things and going down to like atoms and changing things around and making different couplings and things like that. But the ways they were going through them was by evoking magic. And I think some of these results of having, maybe there is some way to get to that socialist type of idea without the bureaucracy. Maybe there is, that we're just not yet able to truly understand, because there's something about humans, about existence, about nature that we don't necessarily get. Maybe it's a kind of situation where once we get asteroids and there actually is an abundance of controllable and reliable energy, and we have human flourishing to the point where we have enough space, people aren't worrying about limited how much actual land on Earth, or the surface of the Earth, the actual land itself, forget that 75% of it is in water. The actual land, I think we only inhabit about 15% of it, tops, like even less. Yeah. So once we can find a way to have everything inhabitable, or other planets or other things, there might just be different things where there's different calculations, people are peacefully parented, where we might have just like different considerations and things in there where we just think we'll default into certain ways, but the current human being doesn't really follow those. The current humans don't take those actions.
It's funny you should bring up alchemy as well, because Hegel's been coming up a lot lately, because it's been argued that Antonio Gramsci, who helped influence the Frankfurt School guys, he went back to Hegel. They were trying to figure out where Marx went wrong, and they looked back to Hegel. And remember, when Hegel was talking about his dialectic, he said, I'm doing alchemy. And you think about thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the idea is, okay, you have a situation, some people act against it, and it produces something new. And he said he was doing alchemy. And I like James Lindsay's analogy on this, because there were people who tried to use mercury to convert lead into gold. And as you know, mercury and lead are both very toxic. He goes, look, you think you're creating gold out of lead? He goes, no, you're drinking mercury and ending up mad as a hatter. And he explained that's how a lot of these philosophies work. And that's where the Mad Hatter character came from, was that when they worked on brims of hats, they'd work with mercury, but it's highly toxic, so you're exposed to that all the time. You go nuts just from absorbing it through your skin and everything.
Yeah, and how many of our leaders were relatively nuts? like forget even just that long ago, but just think about like with Joe Biden in right now, coming in, having this long political career, 47-year political career, where I think for now it's people, increasingly number of people who are in my way of thinking of this, where if a politician comes and says, I've been a politician for decades, they're not considering that a positive thing anymore. No. Because they realize people were so much more grimy in the past. So if you've been able to be in a grimy ass environment that we're figuring out more and more about, chances are higher and higher that you are a grimy ass person for a very long time.
Yeah.
So let alone that, like if you think like right now people are coming up in this big hoobaloo about Bill Clinton speaking on something with Kamala Harris about women's thing. I'm like, most of those people realize that they know people who've done things 100 times worse than Bill Clinton. They understand, like historically, that's the things that were happening. The quid pro quo. That's what part of power was like. So they understand it's not for us. What are we going to do to actually stop it? So those people were garbage human beings in comparison to like people that today we consider that I would never even talk to this person. The people that we look to that actually did contribute major things to the positive things that we have in society today. 99% of their life that wasn't that was horrific stuff. Yeah. And that's something that I think we have to come to. So I think they possibly in 200 years from now, people would look at the things that I did in my life that most of you might think are positive and be like, you were a horrible human being. So we don't know. Those are the things that will actually change over time. Yeah.
Well, and back to the alchemy thing, I remember when we were doing the cynical theories dissection on critical race theory, one of the black feminists, I think it was Patricia Hill Collins, I'm not sure, one of them, it might have been her, I'd have to look, but she wrote a book, The Alchemy of Race. Again, why did she pick that word? George Soros wrote a book, The Alchemy of Finance. Again, why did he pick that word? Hegel runs through all this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm one, I don't find it helpful to use magical language. And I think I'm even just spending some time reading audiobooks and trying to get back into picking different things. And like I just finished one. I finished like one of the anthologies of sci-fi, of the greatest sci-fis ever. And it's a really great anthology. You probably pick up the next part of it. But and I tried to switch to a fantasy book. And I'm just like, fantasy is just, it seems to be lazier science fiction, where it's like, instead of figuring out a way for it to work in practicality, in reality, with different things and machinations, magic. Instead of figuring out the biology that would take to create a unicorn, it's just a unicorn. It's a magical creature that talks to stars. I'm like, so it's like, but that's where we've come from, where the things we don't understand, we just put in magic, and now we have the point where we can actually challenge ourselves and look and be like, okay, can we really have this in a practical sense? And I prefer people going to that. So for me, like we've had conversations with Adam Patrick, he finds some use into it, and I think as other people in the space that I think we'd relate to and get inspiration from and find good meaning from, seem to find some use in using the terms magic, because I do agree that for most people, the way they approach these things is magical. So if you're going to them and trying to argue rationally, that's not going to help. But doesn't mean you have to adopt that. Like I can, if I speak English and I know somebody else doesn't speak English and they only speak like Swahili, I'll speak to them in Swahili, but I still think in English and I still think English is a superior language to that. But to communicate to that person, trying to communicate to them in English would be futile. So I'll use the language that I can communicate to them with, but it won't change the actual content and ideas and my opinions about the things that I consider to be more precise and accurate to my navigation of the reality tunnel. So that's something that I think I would like to mention in lieu of using that term's magic in there. Yeah.
So moving on. In Vietnam, in Cuba, and China, a revolution is being defended and driven forward, which struggles to eschew the bureaucratic administration of socialism. The guerrilla forces in Latin America seem to be animated by that same subversive impulse, liberation. At the same time, the apparently impregnable economic fortress of corporate capitalism shows signs of mounting strain. It seems that even the United States cannot indefinitely deliver its goods, guns and butter, napalm and color TV. The ghetto population may well become the first basis of revolt, and that says in parentheses, though not of revolution. The student opposition is spreading in the old socialist as well as capitalist countries. In France, it has for the first time challenged the full force of the regime and recaptured for a short moment the libertarian power of the red and black flags. Moreover, it has demonstrated the prospects for an enlarged basis. The temporary suppression of the rebellion will not reverse the trend. All right, you want to comment on that?
Again, it's rebellion against what? If that rebellion succeeded, would the world be better than it is today? Because the quality of life for the places Marcuse was living in is objectively exponentially better today than it was when Marcuse was alive for most of the people who are in there. Now, when you talk about corporate capitalism, yes, there is some corporatism going into there, and there's some involvement to that. But now I think, okay, if you talk about, you say the United States is capitalist, but we're talking about here with the guns and the butter and the napalm and the color TVs, how much of the actual factory and manufacturing has been moved outside of the United States of America to, like, let's say, China? Now, if you're saying United States is capitalist because of their drive of that, if their factories are in China, then is China also capitalist? Or like what's going on when you start talking about the global kind of world that we're living in? And that's what I'm thinking, like some of these terms, like capitalism, socialism, like how practical are they to the kind of global world? These were terms that were kind of developed in a situation, in a reality that does not necessarily exist anymore, in a zeitgeist that's kind of gone. Like, this is a general sense how even with socialism, they were saying, like you're saying, the price calculation thing. They were like, okay, we don't have price calculation mechanism, so we still need to at least have a different place that's not socialist, so we can copy their prices on the different things and then adopt that here. So can you truly have global socialism? I don't think you actually can. Then with capitalism, can you truly have an insular capitalist country that has trade with other places, getting resources from other places? Or once it trades and has interactions with other places, do those places then take on some of that capitalism? So what is this amalgamation? What is that new system that we're going to see in the future? That's kind of what I'm interested in.
Well, I had a few comments. So I was going to say, when he says the U.S. is strained, he's partially right, because remember, this is 1969, so people were becoming disillusioned with the Vietnam War because of all the bodies being lost, how much lives being lost, bodies coming home, I guess I would meant to say initially, how many lives being lost. Of course, it's costing money. Remember, this was right before we went off the gold standard, because remember, Kennedy cut taxes, Johnson started the war on poverty, the Vietnam War. It's like, how are we paying for this? This is based on debt. And in the late 60s, early 70s, this is when other countries, notably France, and there were a few countries in the Middle East, started saying, look, we want to redeem our dollars for gold. We don't think you guys have this gold. And of course, we didn't, because we were spending way beyond our means. So when he says the U.S. is strained, he is right in a sense, but it wasn't capitalism as a system was somehow strained. It was the government was living way beyond its means. That's how I would take that. And then it's interesting, he uses the term ghetto population. I guess up until a few years ago, you could say that. Now, if you say that, people attack you. Well, then ghetto also became sort of something that people embrace. Like, there was the clothing style ghetto prep. Of course, mostly rich white kids that wear that, but, but now it's like you're supposed to say urban poor or whatever. And it's interesting, he uses the word libertarian in terms of the black and red anarcho-communist flag. But I should point out, again, being a Marxist, when he says liberation, libertarian, liberating, he doesn't mean it in the sense we mean it. He doesn't mean removing the government's hold. He means liberating from capitalism. So it's important to bear that in mind as that word comes up.
Yeah. I had a conversation like with somebody who identified themselves as a scientific socialist. I was trying to have them define what anarcho-communism was, and they also couldn't figure out how you get to that point without a growth in the state, where the state controls all those things, and then supposedly once it has control of those things, it's just going to relinquish it to the people, to the kindness of their hearts. I don't see that happening.
So, all right, moving on. They confront the critical theory of society with the task of re-examining the prospects for the emergence of a socialist society, qualitative differently from existing societies, the task of redefining socialism and its preconditions. So you talked about different definitions of socialism. In the following chapters, I attempt to develop some ideas first submitted in Eros and Civilization and in One-Dimensional Man, then further discussed in Repressive Tolerance and in lectures delivered in recent years, mostly to student audiences in the United States and in Europe. This essay was written before the events of May and June 1968 in France. That's when there were the student riots. I have merely added some footnotes in the way of documentation. The coincidence between some of the ideas suggested in my essay and those formulated by the young militants was to me striking. The radical utopian character of their demands far surpasses the hypotheses of my essay, and yet these demands were developed and formulated in the course of action itself. They are expressions of concrete political practice. The militants have invalidated the concept of quote-unquote utopia. They have denounced a vicious ideology. No matter whether their action was a revolt or an abortive revolution, it is a turning point. In proclaiming the quote-unquote permanent challenge, in French, la la contestation permanente, or the quote-unquote permanent education, the Great Refusal. They recognize the mark of social repression, even in the most sublime manifestations of traditional culture, even in the most spectacular manifestations of technological progress. They have again raised a specter, in parentheses, and this time a specter which haunts not only the bourgeoisie but all exploitive bureaucracies, the specter of a revolution which subordinates the development of productive forces and higher standards of living to the requirements of creating solidarity for the human species, for abolishing poverty and misery beyond all national frontiers and spheres of interest, for the attainment of peace. In one word, they have taken the idea of revolution out of the continuum of repression and placed it into its authentic dimension, that of liberation. So before you say something, I was just going to point out here that the specter that haunts Europe, that was actually what Marx said about communism. The specter of communism haunts Europe, so that's a reference to that. But he makes the point, he says it's not just the bourgeoisie, it's everybody, because I think what Marx was insinuating by that is that the specter that haunts Europe, that was actually what Marx said about communism. The specter of communism haunts Europe, so that's a reference to that. But he makes the point, he says it's not just the bourgeoisie, it's everybody, because I think what Marx was insinuating by that is that the proletarian were going to wake up and overthrow the system. That's what's haunting Europe. And then Marcuse is saying, no, the ideas of liberation are about to haunt everyone, essentially. And then also the other thing here, what was I going to say? Repression, again, that's the reference to Freud, hence repression tolerance, and then repressive tolerance. And as we talked about liberation, how does he mean that? All right. Thoughts and comments on all this?
When it comes to this, one thing I do appreciate about Marcuse is the use of language, and then I need to not take it for granted that other people are going to be as precise or as particular with the language. Like this is rather academic.
Yeah.
In the actual sense of it, not in like, oh, I'm just going to get a degree in no, I have a graphic design degree. I'm going to say, oh, that's the same as having a degree in engineering, like, because it's all academia. It's like, no, you're going to learn very different things. Like if you're reading an academic paper in engineering and you have a degree in graphic design, some of these words are just going to go over your head. But this is academic in the sense where he's very particular with these terms. Like if you asked him about every one of these particular terms that he used that word for a purpose, not because he just thought it sounded good, and he would have a definition of why he's using that word and what it meant. Now, that's something that definitely changes a lot when you're talking to different people, because different people will have different definitions to what some of these things mean to them. And that's one thing I was thinking with the thing in 1968, when he was writing this, he said it was 1969. Some people will seriously still think that the world was better back then. And I'm like, I don't understand what you think about history to think that you would somehow prefer living in the 70s than today. Like, and maybe somebody in their lived experience actually thinks that, because when he talks about this with the attainment of peace, like, is the world more peaceful now than it was back then? And I think it is. I don't understand how people can think it is. It won't be. Now, I think a difference was that ends of civilizations used to happen. It used to be a situation where not ends of civilizations, ends of communities, ends of towns, cities, clans, those kind of things used to happen, where it was like over a certain time, there was a certain storyline, certain arcs. Societies and cultures would fall certain arcs. The Roman Empire was the empire, and then it ended up being nothing at all. Yeah. If you have what the American is today, I don't think United States of America, like some of the things that I don't like about sci-fi is like 200 years or like 1,000 years in the future, and they're still like, oh, United States of America. I'm like, no. United States of America is not going to exist as like a North American country in 1,000 years in the future. Like it will end, but it's not going to end I don't think things will end in that destructive sense where it's like, okay, everything is completely gone. People go back in history and be like, oh, people lived here in the past. Like we're going to rediscover certain things that these people had, because that's kind of how it happens with previous ways. When somebody died, when something ended, it would be catastrophic, complete end, possibly wiped out of the earth. Now I think it's more like it will morph into change something else. And you look at different ideologies and different things that have been changing. And I think he was seeing certain markers that in the past, historically, did presage an actual complete end of that culture. It was heading towards, as it had. There was the World War I and II was a culmination of just a long warring period where it's just these groups of people would have beef with these groups of people. They'd intermarry for a while, then somebody would do this and buy that land there, and then somebody will come in, and this other person from the outside would come in and do this, and then all of a sudden, like something would spark. There'd be a war of like 7-year war.
Yeah.
It's like people were fighting, like, and then during that 7-year war, there was multiple clans that were not at the top, but they would have their own cultures and languages and like ideology that were completely wiped out, or they would just completely leave. Like this place is completely abandoned, and that's the kind of ideology that I think, that's the kind of history, that's the kind of thing that was in our nature, to think like loss was death. And think about the things people today consider loss. That most of the people listen to this, you have people around you who bemoan certain losses when it's just like, it's something so minor when it actually comes to the reality of the things. Like, and you're just like, are you really crying over that? Whereas, so that's, I think something that with some of these terms, with some of these words, I'd be very curious to think what other people would actually think and associate when they hear some of these terms, and some of the things that I think Marcuse was accurately seeing, I think were based off of an expectation of a different sort of calculation that is not necessarily being, like, if you have, when people talk about wars happening again, like, how do you actually see that happen? Like, where do you actually see the ability to maintain and run a world war kind of situation where it's like a massive part of humanity is engaged in war for an extended period of time over, and like, how do you think the resources are going to happen? How is there going to be support? Like, I just don't see that happening, and maybe I'm the one who's entirely wrong, and I think that's a positive thing. Now, I would wonder, would Marcuse say it's that way now because his ideas have actually won out, or is it despite his ideas not being adopted, and him saying if we actually adopted some of his ideas, it would be even more peaceful and more, we'd have more human flourishing, we'd have more lack of misery and things like that, because I think he would definitely be aware of how much more miserable history was than he actually knew at that time, I think. Yeah.
Well, also to add on to your fall of Rome, it's important to emphasize with something like that, and it may be the same with this country too. It wasn't like a fell sudden swoop, like, okay, you had Rome and then it fell. It was, the empire was gradually ceding territory. It couldn't afford to defend it. Of course, before that, there was a split between East and West. Different groups were gradually seizing lands on the edge. I know Rome was sacked a few times, and it was 476 when Rome fell that Odoacer took over Rome, declared himself king, and then that's officially the end. And they say the Senate actually continued to meet for some time after that, but they're not clear to when they stopped, because at that point the Senate had no power. They were more figureheads anyway. The emperor was deposed, and then what was Rome gradually fractured, and those became fiefdoms. The lords that were strong enough to survive, of course, conquered other people. Those eventually became countries, on and on. I know also the Byzantines recaptured Rome but lost it. So it would be a similar thing with America. Like, I know when you were with Adam Patrick on his show, you guys talked about America breaking up into sections. It could be something like that, where it breaks up into sections. Some do well, one falls apart, one recaptures an old territory. Who knows? It's not going to be, okay, you have a world power, then it just collapses all at once. It's a series of phases.
Yeah, and I think, this is what I ask people, do you think the world's going more towards what China's trying to do, trying to get that hegemonic type of control, one culture, one society, get everyone under one thing with the huge, massive People's Party, like the communist, the CCP, the
Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, where they're just becoming that hegemon, becoming that monoculture type of thing. There's no way you're going to be able to do that and establish that. Like, there's no way China, as China is, can come to Kenya and then dominate Kenyans. What they can do is, right now, they can have the few people who are in control of certain things and have access to certain things and resources get into contracts and sell out Kenyans and things. But they're not going to be able to bring Han Chinese culture and have the entire nation of Kenya just adopt that. It's like, no, this is not going to happen. What's probably going to happen is more going towards like what's happening in the United States of America. You're talking about the senators being figureheads.
Yeah.
I mean, the senators are pretty much figureheads. Where it's just like, oh, you're going to vote one way anyway. It's like 50-50. We know it's 50-50. We know like 49 of the Democrats are going to vote this way. 49 of the Republicans are going to vote that way. There might be one or two people who would change things. And we know that's going to happen. It doesn't matter if it's this person, if it's Joe Sixpack from Alabama, or if it's Joe Sixpack, Republican from Alabama, or Mike Winecooler, Republican from Alabama, if they're in the Senate, they're going to vote the same way regardless. Like we're not it's not like, oh, there's going to be a really big difference between these two people. It's like, no, because they kind of are already figureheads. You already have the situation where people like sanctuary cities. This things would happen. People are like making declarations. Oh, we're going to do this. We're going to do that. Trump came in and put a lot of his declarations, and Biden came in and said, we're not going to do any of those anymore. Then when Biden leaves, the next person is going to say, we're not going to do any of those anymore. And you're really having states where it's like, we're not going to listen to you anymore. So that's probably what's going to happen more in the world. The global culture is going to be like that. It's going to be more, I think, more cities and more tight, smaller areas where people come together and have certain agreements and like, oh, we like these laws, we like these rules, we're going to pick and choose in this place, and we're going to have certain relations with this other place somewhere else. You wouldn't even have that, where the Chinese government is already going to like smaller level people to make little agreements between little townships and little areas where you'll find some small town in Nebraska gets somehow over 50% of its revenue from some relationship it has with the Chinese Communist Party. Because instead of them having the factory in Nebraska, they have some kind of things where they make a component and then they ship it there. And then that component is finished in China and then shipped to the rest of the world. And that's how the relationship works. Now, does the Chinese Communist Party somehow have an incentive, instead of having that relationship, to send 1 million of its People's Liberation Army members to occupy Nebraska so they can have that? What's the sense in that? It's not going to happen that kind of way. That's not the direction the world is going into. Trade and things like that have provided so many more profitable and safer and easier ways to get many more benefits than could come from destruction and warfare and things like that. That, to me, is a positive thing.
Well, as you and Adam discussed too, as far as globalism as a libertarian thing, that's very good. I mean, freedom of movement, freedom of trade, all this. But we talked about different religions and philosophies earlier. I mean, Jews 5,000 years later, there's still multiple tribes and multiple sects within Judaism. Christianity split into hundreds of churches that can't agree on the same thing. It's like you can't impose one value system on the entire world and just expect everyone to say, this is great, let's all believe this. That'll never happen. I mean, it can't happen within individual religions, within individual countries. How are you going to do that on a world scale? There's no way. Like human nature does not allow that.
And the amount of control on information they had back then was infinitely more than they have now. Like you just can't. You're not going to be able to keep those things. Like it's individualism will win through.
Yeah. All right. So last sentence in the preface. The young militants know or sense that what is at stake is simply their life, the life of human beings, which has become a plaything in the hands of politicians and managers and generals. The rebels want to take it out of these hands and make it worth living. They realize that this is still possible today, and the attainment of this goal necessitates a struggle which can no longer be contained by the rules and regulations of a pseudo-democracy in a free Orwellian world. Interesting choice. To them, I dedicate this essay.
Yeah. Interesting. You see, the Orwellian thing is coming around in a free Orwellian world. The regulations of a pseudo-democracy in a free Orwellian world. What does he mean by that?
That's the thing, because remember, Orwell wanted to do socialism, but of course he was critical of Leninism and the whole bureaucracy and everything. So I don't know, maybe he was sympathetic to what Orwell was saying, but of course Orwell himself was critical of totalitarianism, and that's sort of at odds with Marcuse, because as we discussed with Repressive Tolerance, Marcuse talks about creating an ideal democracy and socialism without bureaucracy, but it's how do you achieve that without bureaucracy? There's really, again, we'll get into it as this essay goes on, but it's not clear to me that's really attainable.
Okay, so he's talking about Orwell in his regular speaking and ideology and his regular life thing. Like when I hear Orwell, I normally default to 1984. So I was like, okay, well, how is free 1984 world? But no, that was just one of his most popular books. Is him as a person had his own ideas and things like that. So okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh yeah, so the rebels and so that's one thing. Again, I would be very curious to think. Does he think the life? Would he judge that today is an improvement in 1969, and what would he attribute those changes, those improvements or reductions in quality of life to? I would be interested to see.
All right, so I'll start the introduction now. He says, up to now, it it has been one of the principal tenets of the critical theory of society, and then parentheses, and particularly Marxian theory, to refrain from what might be reasonably called utopian speculation. Social theory is supposed to analyze existing societies in the light of their own functions and capabilities, and to identify demonstrable tendencies, in parentheses, if any, which might lead beyond the existing state of affairs. By logical inference from the prevailing conditions and institutions, critical theory may also be able to determine the basic institutional changes which are the prerequisites for the transition to a higher stage of development, quote unquote, higher in the sense of a more rational and equitable use of resources, minimization of destructive conflicts, and enlargement of the realm of freedom. But beyond these limits, critical theory did not venture for fear of losing its scientific character. All right.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that? Oh.
Yeah, again, this is just also the limitation on what you can do. We had people who were, one of the sci-fi books I was reading was the last story. A couple of stories had things about Mars. And these were the brightest and the best minds of sci-fi, with access to the top scientists of their time in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s. So some of the things they were writing about Mars, I'm just like, I knew that was not a thing, a possibility, like when I was like 12, because I had this more access to information than they had when I was 12 in 1990. I had more access to information. It was in the 90s than they had, but the top scientists back then. Like the last story I was reading was talking about, I was like a red planet, like, oh, they're walking around and there's an old civilization there, and it was red, like the red sky, and like, we have a rover there right now taking photos that, yeah, have been colored on it, but we know it's not red anymore. Like it might be like the reddish soil with iron in it, but that whole idea, even from the what was like Total Recall movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, where he goes outside and his face swells up and whatnot. But even from then, they still had the reddish tint. But we understand that's not how it's going to be anymore, because we actually have robots, have rovers, have helicopters there getting certain things. So even if they were being scientific, it was based off of limited information. They just didn't have the ability to actually get certain things. And with here, social theory, this is one thing that we've pointed out and we see often, where part of the current timeline, people who are activists in this have to ignore the actual existing society.
Yeah.
Because what they talk about existing doesn't exist. I'm like, what are you talking about? That's not the way society is. We have to pretend that we're living in that time and ignore all this other information that we have. And I give Marcuse a pass because he just didn't have access to that certain information.
Yeah.
And as we mentioned earlier, also some of these things are applied to historical societies, and those histories were even more limited in the actual knowledge and information that we had about them, that was written by very certain people with very biased actual ideas, and putting that bias in there, and also for them having very limited information to actually make the assumptions and things, and the results of the actual things that we saw. How many actual societies did we see? When we talk about Rome, how much more do we know about Roman society over the last 50 years than we did from the fall of Rome until the 50 years before that? I think we've learned so much more just by the ability of going in there and having more ways to actually deal with that information. So those are the kind of things that I'm thinking, where it's like, again, my main thing is like, I wish Marcuse could be alive now, and I see how he would deal with this new information, these new details, understanding epigenetics, understanding evo psychology, understanding human behavioral like science and human behavioral psychology, those kind of things. I'd be very curious to think and have him understand some of these things and see if that would change his thinking. Yeah.
Well, and also the emphasis too, he talks about critical theory and the what is the term he used here? Social theory. That's also called traditional theory. Like the idea that it's not, I think what a lot of his, I guess, successors don't get is that it's not just, he didn't just nitpick the society and find what's wrong with it. He understood the current society as it was. And if you read Horkheimer, his book on critical theory, I've read excerpts from it, not the whole thing, but he talks about, okay, how did certain science evolve? How was certain science suppressed because it didn't serve the status quo? How did it become accepted because it benefited the status quo? Like, there was a very rigorous analysis of why things are. The people today just seem to want to tear things down and hope utopia will reign. Like in that video on environmental justice that James Lindsay did with Sovereign Nations, he talked about that, how there are interesting ideas with energy. Like they talked about filtering out seawater. There's carbon in seawater, using that. There's something about a machine that it does something with algae to extract excessive CO2 from the environment. Like, there are actual scientific solutions for some of the things they're talking about, but they don't want to think it through and come up with ideas. They just seem to want to tear it down and hope somehow the ideal civilization will emerge in its place. And again, for Marcuse, like you say, the time he was writing it made a little more sense, but also he did have a better understanding of how and why things are the way they are. Whereas these people are more the nihilists. Let's just tear things down and hope our ideal will emerge in its place. There's no, you know, like James Lindsay says, you see it with Marxism, the feminism, the race stuff. There's just this attitude of let's wake people up. Somehow they'll figure out how things are. They'll tear everything down, and then utopia will emerge. There's no explanation for how and why all those things will happen.
Yeah, magic, like you said. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Utopian possibilities are inherent in the technical and technological forces of advanced capitalism and socialism. The rational utilization of these forces on a global scale would terminate poverty and scarcity within a foreseeable future. But we know now that neither their rational use nor, and this is decisive, their collective control by the quote, immediate producers, in parentheses, the workers, would itself eliminate domination and exploitation. A bureaucratic welfare state would still be a state of repression, which would continue even into the, quote, second phase of socialism, end quote, when each is to receive, quote, according to his needs, end quote.
Okay, a few things on this. Foreseeable future. Again, we're talking about he's using very specific terms here. Yeah. And I would prefer for him to, some of these, it's kind of the prophetic things where you say foreseeable future, 40 days and 40 nights, where it's just like sometime. You know? So does he mean 100 years? Does he mean 1,000 years? Because how far can some people foresee? And I don't know what the average real way that some people can project. It seems to be frightfully short for some people, and that could be part of the things. Like I know for me, moving around in my childhood years, it's kind of hard for me to develop imagining living in one place for long enough, because like every 5 years I moved to a different continent. So that's programmed me in a certain way where I would try to understand and relate to somebody who's only lived in one place their whole life. So for them, they can like, yeah, I can imagine just living here for my whole life. And now got to the point where there's a few places I can think, yeah, if I had to pick a place and I was told, okay, you're never going to leave, there's a few places I can think that I've lived in, and like, I think I'd be comfortable just being there. But for some people, it's always been that one place. But now it's been that one place, and then they can think 80 years in that one place. So is their point of view only limited to their lives? Then if you don't have kids, once you have kids, that normally connects people to their clan, their genetic line, and they start thinking, once I have kids, I'm thinking about my kids' life post my life that relates you back to what your parents might have been thinking about their life past your life. Then that connects you to that stream of life. And then you start going in and thinking, okay, now I'm going to have my kids' lives. And you start thinking in that different way. And how many people in the West and involved in some of these movements don't have that connection, that have been kind of cut off in that situation, that are active in this kind of thing. So they don't really have that. When they're thinking about foreseeable future, it's their life. They're thinking, I need to be okay end of this year. I need to be okay in my job. They're not even thinking career, like, oh, I have this job, I'm going to be here for 6 years. So it's kind of that foreseeable future. What do you think, on average, people think about foreseeable future in that kind of situation?
It's so funny because I'm thinking of Hegel now, the whole dialectic, and the idea that, I guess Marx later too, the idea that the end of history is that things keep becoming perfected and eventually that's the end of history. There's no more progress to be made. Now, what's interesting with Hegel is that Hegel thought the Prussian state was basically God's will on earth, and that the Prussian state was mankind at its highest form. Of course, we know obviously that wasn't the case, and that was the real challenge when Hegel died, because it's like, wait, where do we go from here? I mean, do we continue to follow the Prussian state, or then of course the young Hegelians, that was Marx and company, Feuerbach I think was his mentor, they thought, okay, wait a minute, they stood Hegel on his head, to use their words. And remember, Marx, I think he was writing 1840s, he died 1870s, I want to say. He predicted that the socialist revolution would happen soon in industrialized countries. But what happened early 20th century, it only happened in Russia, which was a backwards feudal country. So even in his own lifetime, he was way off. And then, of course, he's been wrong since. Hitler came to power in 1933. He said, the Third Reich will last 1,000 years. It lasted a little over a decade. So again, it's like, what level of arrogance do you have to think I'll found this and it'll keep going for 1,000 years from now? I mean, who could predict even, I mean, a fraction of that time into the future, much less 1,000 years.
Yeah, so that's a sorry, that's a thing to think about.
Yeah.
Where even when people look at history, this is why I think we need a new form of storytelling, because I think as we grew up, like this part of the reason why African religions aren't adopted by the rest of the world, where you have the Abrahamic religions have had a way to be adopted by different cultures and different people in all over the globe, in Asia and South America and Africa, that didn't have this history, where they completely accepted a white Jesus, a white Mary, because it was brought to them by the white people who had accepted something from the Jews and the Middle Easterns and the Semitic people and adopted that into their way. So that was more a global. It was explaining, containing more of what humans knew at that time, and I think we've left that now. Now, because when you look at history, people were like 6,000 years ago, when you actually read the Bible and you read the actual dates, and some people, many Christians still think that. It's like, no, the world's a lot longer.
Yeah.
How do people understand that billions of years to come to understanding that for most of existence existing, humans haven't even existed? So how do people even grasp that, let alone to think in the future of the things that you might do? That it's a tough kind of thing. So it's kind of like, forget the foreseeable future. The unknowable past is another massive massive question. The foreseeable future is one thing. The unimaginable past is another thing. Like, how do you imagine existence before there was beings to imagine existence? Like, how do you even put that into some kind of understanding? That it's kind of a tough thing. And
well, but this is why Karl Popper was critical of Marx, Hegel, Plato, and he'd be critical of the SJWs today. It's historicism. It's the idea that history has a preordained goal that we're all collectively working towards, and that's where that expression right side of history comes from. The idea is anything working towards that is on the right side of history. Anything that's not is wrong. But that assumes that history has some preordained end goal that we can foresee and we're all working towards. That assumes you can predict history, and good luck with that.
Yeah, I'm trying to find out if he had children. Peter Marcuse, he had one child.
Yeah.
So what Peter Marcuse is about. So I guess that kind of tied him in a bit to that, because and I think that is one thing that I hope maybe somebody's studying already, to see the difference between world leaders and just people in positions of power that have kids versus don't. Now, there could be something. I wrote this article on my Substack about the relationship with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. I truly think Joe Biden loves his son.
Yeah.
And I think that does influence his way. And if he did influence him, I would consider him to be rather inhuman, rather not even inhuman, just rather unnatural.
Yeah.
Life forms in different ways. Different animals do it in different ways. Some abandoned, like relatively abandoned, but they still do something. They still even go through the process of, most animals will at least pick a most possible healthy female partner or male partner to reproduce with, and have those things. At least they won't just settle for whatever is there. They'll try to actually select. Even if they're not directly parenting, they will at least try to give their kids that advantage. Even those fish that just have like millions of, they're like, we're still going to at least decide somehow the best spawning pool area. So there is some aspect there. So I get that. And we talk about with monarchies, and some of the positives was, with the monarchies, some of the positives of that was that they were invested in keeping the country in a certain way because their kids were going to take over that country. Now you kind of wonder, like, is that really the same in the kind of sense? But that's kind of part of why I'm also thinking there's not going to be these massive wars, because most of the people still are very landlocked and locational.
Yeah.
But the people in power who would be able to have these wars, they're not landlocked. They're not really dedicated to the average top Chinese Communist Party member that would actually be able to control and start a world war has much less in common with your average Chinese person than with Joe Biden.
Yeah.
So why would he decide to fight Joe Biden and then go live back in China when he would rather be able to go back and forth? Like when China's going to bomb the West Coast, where in the West Coast are they going to bomb after they've sent 300,000 of their best and brightest kids to the West Coast to different schools in the United States of America. Where are they going to bomb? Like, what's going on? So that's the kind of things where I'm thinking where that's already there and established in a different way where you have different kind of relationships. But I would like to see the difference between people in power who don't have kids versus people in power who do have kids, like the different things, like you look at the Angela Merkel's and things like that who don't. So that's with the foreseeable future type of thing. So I'm wondering if Peter Marcuse is the German-American lawyer, Marcuse's son, professor. He was born in 1928. So yeah, he was at least up and about while Marcuse was writing some of these things. Do you have anything to say also on that? There's one more thing I think I've taken some notes on here. Anything else?
No, that's it. I was going to move on.
Okay. So one more thing was here, this the end, the second phase of socialism, again with the foreseeable future. If he was thinking 40, like what do you think right now that foreseeable future has arrived? The bureaucratic says the workers would itself eliminate domination and exploitation. A bureaucratic welfare state would still be a state of repression of which would continue even into the second phase of socialism. I think that's most definitely a bureaucratic socialist, bureaucratic welfare state does exist in the United States of America and many of first world countries in the world. So that status has been achieved. But a second, when each is to receive, so coming even into where each is to receive according to his needs. You do live in a kind of demand economy in the United States of America and many places in the West, and many civilized, westernized cities. I don't want to say westernized anymore because now is Japan westernized? Is Tokyo westernized?
Some would argue, yes. Some would argue, yes, because technology, technology, clothing styles. If you go back far enough when they had steamships and trains and things, that's
but then what would the equivalent of an easternized? Is there even a concept like an easternized city, or does it go back into where it's like I was saying, it's not the West is the best. It's just that the West has adopted the best ways of thinking from humans at the moment. So it's this when Eastern cities and African cities adopt certain ways of doing things, they're just adopting the best or the most prevalent ideas that humans have that they would have probably come to eventually if exposed to certain things. So anyway, I think we should have a separate talk on that. Just on that phrase.
Remember when we did the video on post-colonial series, they talked about the idea of Orientalism, the idea that the West is a dominant culture, so they're imposing their ideas on everyone, and that to become empowered, these colonized people are supposed to rediscover their culture, and that would make them self-actualized and happier and wealthier and all this. That's what they were saying. So there was no concept of, wait a minute, people in Southeast Asia somehow impose their culture elsewhere and Westerners are expunging it. It's more the West ruled everything else, so they're imposing their culture on all these countries, and that these people should sort of resurrect their old traditions and customs, and that's how they'll become self-actualized. And if you remember, there was sort of this split in that movement because there were postmodern versus modern critiques of this, but there were also people, I know there were some Indian scholars, for example, who said, look, we have to acknowledge that the West did give us a lot of good things. We can retain our culture, our values, all this, but let's not throw out technology, science, all this, because it's given us a lot of benefits too. But let's examine the laws and see, okay, are these laws that we want, or are these things that the British imposed on us? And I think Japan is interesting because Japan was never colonized, but they're sort of that best of both worlds where they still have samurai, they still have their food, all this, but at the same time, they realize, wait a minute, we need modern technology because that's how we're going to get ahead. So I think there's that whole dynamic.
And I think it's kind of a situation where, according to his needs, where don't we live in a world where different cultures and societies seem to take things from the general knowledge of humanity and adopt the things according to the needs of the people in power or the individuals who are in those societies. Like, yeah, we'll take this part of Christianity, we'll take this part of power grids, we'll take this part of this, but we'll still have a caste system. Okay? Yeah, I guess that's according to your needs and your culture, you're going to do that. Yeah. But then the United States of America won't go and say, okay, there's some things in India, we'll take the caste system. It's like, no, we'll take the way like you guys work and your work ethic in certain places and establish certain working places, and then we'll figure that we have certain needs that you're able to provide. We'll do that. Like we were talking about earlier with China, the difference. I think I was listening to Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. He was having the Classless podcast, and he was talking about how the difference between that one thing that Donald Trump had done very specifically was he came out and he said, I recognize your territorial interests. You have interests in your territory, and I'm not going to come here and judge you and damn you for the things that you do in Russia and damn you for the things that you do in China. I'm going to be very quiet mostly when I talk about you on the public stage because we have our own issues.
Yeah.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to put United States the primacy. I'm going to also have that territorialism, and then we're to have the things that we can actually benefit from together. We'll do that, and we just won't touch much on those other things. Like, yes, we wouldn't do that in the United States of America, but if you're doing it there, that's not for you to say. And then China also during Trump's time was a little different, but then recently they just came out, and I think they had that meeting in Alaska where they come out and saying like, look, Black Lives Matter. They actually mentioned Black Lives Matter with the top level diplomatic meeting was saying like, yeah, look, your country's racist. You're saying we have issues with the Uyghurs, but look, your country's racist. Look at the black people in your country. They're saying you're racist. So like, what are you telling us about? Like, so it's that kind of situation where that moralizing, where it's like, no, you take it according to your needs, and then a little on top of that is this according to his needs thing. Who actually practices that in their life?
Yeah.
But it's I need a living wage, and they say like I need you to give me something else to define this, like, but they don't care about the needs of those other people. They want to judge the needs of the other people, say you don't need that. How do you know that person doesn't need that? How do you know that person doesn't need his 50th pair of Jordans? Like, should I say like, no, I need 2 pairs, so I need you to, before you buy your 50th pair, you have 49, instead of you buying that 50th, you have to give me that 50th? Why? Like who's to say that kind of situation? So who actually practices this? Because you can go out there. A lot of people have enough income to still stay alive and just go around and supply people's needs, but instead they want to depend on a state to go out and redistribute that instead of them doing it on their own.
You okay?
There's this little bug in here. I don't know if you hear it. Mosquito. Mosquito.
So I just had 2 comments on this. So it's interesting you bring that up about China, because I think the whataboutism, that expression actually started because of the Soviet Union, because we would criticize their human rights violations and they would say, well, what about slavery? What about segregation? All this. But it's I and others have been accused of whataboutism, but I make the point that if I criticize other people, I'm not justifying things here. Like people, that it was that point the other day about how what the woke say is evil about America. They act like it's somehow unique to America, and what's good about America is somehow common, when literally the opposite is true. And when they bring up slavery and I say, well, every country on earth had slavery, they say that's whataboutism. But I say, no, that doesn't fit the technical definition, because the definition would be if I used other countries had slaves as a way of deflecting from America, saying, well, other countries had slaves, so what? That would be whataboutism. I'm saying, yes, America had slaves, that was terrible, but so did everyone else. So by that logic, isn't everyone else terrible? And if the answer is no, why are you singling out America specifically? And it gives the impression there's some other underlying reason. And my other comment is about each according to his needs. That's the famous Marxist line about from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. My friend Mikhail is Russian. Ironically, he says the simple question to ask on that is, what happens when the ability to provide each according to his needs exceeds the ability to do it? Like, people talk about Scandinavia and the healthcare, how great it is. Well, it's a small, wealthy country with very healthy people. We have all these issues here with obesity, diabetes, pre-existing conditions. They say tax the rich. Well, what's going to happen? The rich are just going to put their money in offshore accounts. They're going to pass on the costs in other ways. It's not like, again, there's no Smog or Scrooge McDuck pile of gold that we can just keep taking from indefinitely. These costs are a real thing. Trade-offs are a real thing. You're not going to get around this. Whatever genius is, whatever computer programs you put in place, you're not going to get around it. There's just no way.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I think most people in the United States of America, in the West, most people hearing this have lived in cultures where they all have lived with money for their whole life, currency. So they assume that they know what it is, what it represents, but they don't. Like, I still have lived in places where I remember when I was younger, like we'd come back to Kenya and then we'd go to the village, and it was like the grandparents would prefer you take them a chicken than give them money, even if you give them money that could buy them like 50 chickens, because they just still have that relationship where they grew up when they still barter, where currency wasn't a thing. Like Kenya was colonized. They didn't have like, they think they still were using some paper from the United States, from the United Kingdom. But when they came into, that was mostly in Nairobi areas. When you go into the village in Western Kenya, where the tribe that I'm from is from, they weren't using currency. Like, currency hadn't been developed by those cultures. So they have histories of rather recent histories where people didn't have the concept of money. So it meant something different to them. It's something they had to learn and understand. Like, Now we're getting things with like insurance, like people paying for like school, like life insurance. These kind of things are now coming into different structures and being adopted in different ways. But there was an assumption of people seem to understand dumb things like, oh, we're getting this money, this stimulus, and it's like you're not just getting the stimulus. You're gonna have to pay with your kids. That whole like foreseeable future. You're gonna be paying for it for your foreseeable future. There was that one meme. It's there's this meme from this religious group. It's this religious song where it was like a meme where, interesting enough, like my mom was listening to the song before, and like I heard her actually listen to the actual playing of it. It's from some evangelist group. Sorry, that was probably very loud. I probably need to take that down. I need to remember. I'm going to write down to remember to take that down. Take down the clap. Take down the clap. Although when I do the post-production, I normally level down the sound. Okay, so you have a situation where it was like this meme where it's like, okay, how long are people going to be paying all this stimulus money that's coming out with the coronavirus? And then it's like, the children, forever, forever, they can sing, they can talk about because they're going to be paying for it. So that's the kind of thing where people are talking about, where is this money going to come from? How are people going to pay for these things? They don't really understand the actual practicalities of some of these things. And how the welfare state can't get much bigger than it is now. That's why with some of these things, they're just going to end. It just literally cannot continue. You cannot literally just keep the money printers going brr. The money printers have been going brr for the last 20 years. Yeah. They can't go brr anymore. Like there's no more brr to do. Like even if you literally just cashed in all the billionaires, people assume way too much. People assume those billionaires. They talk about the Scrooge McDuck thing. First of all, there's very few of them.
Yeah.
In one aspect, they talk about, oh, it's the 0.0001% own this much. Listen to what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's such few people.
Yeah.
And the amount that they own is also such little actual amount of what is actually in the world that you cannot divide that up and then have everybody all of a sudden still be as productive as those few people with that little amount of thing. That's not the way it works. And it's also not just sitting there, liquid money in some kind of bank. All that stuff is invested in their assets and their it's very frustrating. It's
also funny, the conversation I've had with rich kids where I'll say things like, oh, you can afford it, rich kid, or something, and they'll say like, oh, I'm not rich, I'm broke. And like, I was like, yes, okay, in a very literal sense, yes, you don't have a bank account with a few million in it that you can withdraw, but your parents pay for sometimes help with your rent, they paid for your college, they pay for all these things. It's like, that's not normal for most people. It's like, if my parents had paid for all those things for me, you know how much money I could have saved? I would have a lot. I probably have a few more times amount invested right now, but it's like, yeah, you don't have a bank account you can draw millions from, but it's like you're being taken care of in other ways. You're not poor, you know?
Yeah. And it's, again, I think it goes part of the ivory tower thing. How many of the people who think like this have been through colleges where they talk about how amazing of a time that is? And I saw, some group who talks about like urbanization and things like that. They're like, oh, they're talking about how colleges, don't you remember how life was in university and things like that? And how many people talk about that was the happiest time of their life. And somebody's like, yeah, it's because you had these things that were controlled and you had these responsibilities. It was a community that was designed. So we should design cities like that where people can live and have time to think and then enrich their lives and their minds. I was just like, ew, this is normal thought. Like, no, that's completely socialized, artificial environment. Like that can't work. Where everybody, no matter what you're doing, if you just are allowed to be in that school, if you qualify to be in that school and you pay your $40,000, you have access to all the same resources as everybody else. Even like for example, the star football athlete comes in there, and due to that person's activities, there's millions of dollars coming into the school, yet you still go and sit in the same cafeteria, you go to the same gym, you go to the same training. If you get hurt, you go to the same medical facility in that location. You kind of have the same free time. You go to the same parties and things like that. Then that person his personal activities are bringing $10 million into that school every year. And then that is socialized out to everybody else. So you kind of feel, I have this free time to think and read my poetry and write my blog and write these screeds about how the world should be this way. It's like, no, you're living like that because of, first of all, subsidization by the government. And second, because there's a few people who happen to actually be very productive and bringing in so much money into that school that they're able to subsidize the 99.9% of you people who are just there as a drain on the system, really taking in debts.
Well, that's like my friend with the gender studies degree. Like, I don't want to beat her up too much, but like she has this like, well, I wanted to learn this, and oh, it was very fulfilling. What are you going to do with that? Oh, I don't know. And it's like she's denied this, but I'm pretty sure her family still supports her. I'm like, and I've told her this to her face, by the way. This isn't gossiping. I'm like, you don't get it. Like your family has money. You have the luxury to do this. Most people, especially poor people, they're trying to think, what job do I get out of school? I graduated culinary school. I started working a week later. It wasn't, well, I'm going to hang out. Oh, I'm going to travel and, I'll figure things out. No, it was, okay, you better start working and providing for yourself and moving up. So the whole world can't function the way your experience did. It's just, it's completely unsustainable.
Yeah. And it takes, like you said, you don't need to beat her up about it, because I'm kind of more towards that side of it, where I have had the benefit of having a situation where I've been able to be subsidized to some extent. Like my parents were in a position where they were able to pay for my schooling. I didn't have to work for it on my own. And then I did more like graphic design on my own, but my parents have been together, been stable enough to have some kind of thing to fall back on. I've had enough friends and meet people like you to travel around and meet other people and have a certain life. But I don't expect that to be the norm for the general population anytime soon. Just like I look at other people's realities and their expectations and their kind of lived experiences and say, like, that couldn't be the norm for me, because that's not where I came from. It's like you can't just move to a country and establish and live there in the same way as somebody who's been born and lived in that country, who has his entire clan and family and the support system in that location. Like, the way I'm living here in Nairobi, Kenya, I'm living here in Nairobi, Kenya because I have family and relatives here. I can't do the same thing if I just moved to the United States of America, and vice versa. Like, there's people in the United States of America doing that wouldn't be able to do it here. So that's the way life is that there's actually diversity in the actual individual lives that we live. Yeah.
And I made it because I know some libertarian types too will say to me like, oh, it's voluntary. She's not violating anyone's rights. Don't be judgmental. And my response is like, look, she has a right to do that. If her parents were willing to do that, it's voluntary, it's agreed upon, fine. My point is this can't work on a large scale. It's not, okay, everyone can just decide to study things for fun and all their parents will support them. That cannot work on a large scale. There's no way. No.
Yeah. Like 2 + 2 is 4. So I can judge somebody and say, oh, no, like you're actually wrong by saying it's 5. It's their voluntary choice to say it's 5, but they're wrong. It's like it's not as applicable. So it's like, it's her voluntary choice to do what she did. It's my voluntary choice to make the things that I did, but there's trade-offs. There's certain things I'm going to miss out. And there's certain things that are very particular to me that influenced me to even be able to make that decision, to even come to the point where it's like some people are going to decide between A, B, C, D, and other people are going to decide between Q, R, P, S, and they're not going to have access to A, B, C, D. And it's not saying that any are better. I think a world where there's more choice, where more of the things that you're doing are due to you choosing to do X, Y, Z, is positive. And that's, I think, part of why I think this content is very intriguing to me, is because a lot of people who seem to be following this content seem to be abdicating their agency and saying, no, people have no control on their lives, or these things that I have in my life, I have nothing to do with them. I'm abdicating them to a greater power that's outside of me. I'm like, no. It's your decisions, and it might still suck where you're at. But once you recognize it's your decisions, you also recognize that your decisions can also, to an extent, get you out of that position. Or also in the situation where realizing that your decisions got you here, or other people's decisions got you here, might be a way where you can show other people so they don't make those decisions, rather than you saying that's just the way things are going to be. Yeah.
Well, because to sort of add on to this, I was thinking about this earlier. Like, I know someone who grew up heavily dependent on welfare and food stamps. But the thing is, this person ended up successful. Like, they went to school. I think they got 2 master's degrees. They have a good job. They've gotten into investing, all this. So there are people who use these systems well. But I would say this person is above average intelligence, hardworking, all this. You can't assume that everyone is going to do that. That's the problem. Because I think it was Reagan who said the whole point of welfare is to eliminate the need for its own existence. If everyone were like this person, yeah, these programs would disappear because there'd be no need anymore. But unfortunately, not everyone is going to do that right thing. That's the sad part.
Yeah. And this is the way it happens. We hear sometimes, we're like, oh, there's nepotism, or oh, George Bush was president because his dad was George Bush. George W. Bush was president because his dad was George Bush. Like, yeah, sure, that helped.
Yeah.
But look at Jeb Bush.
Yeah.
Like, Jeb Bush didn't become president.
No.
Like, there's also other Bushes out there. Not all the Bushes got there. You look at the situation, like what's happening in the royal family in the United Kingdom. Like, there was a lot of, like, Queen Elizabeth had relatives, had siblings, cousins, and things like that. They didn't get there. Look what's happening with Prince Harry right now. He's in the actual in the line there, but chances of him actually becoming king are slim to none. How many other minor royals and other people are there? So even with these people with such access to these highest levels of society and things like that, how many of those people with all those access and things actually do become grand and achieve anything in life? Most of them are just regular, basic ass people that we never hear about, that just live in a more comfortable life. That's pretty much it. But they still just live basic ass lives.
Yeah. All right. All right. Let's move on. Let's see here. Freedom would become the environment of an organism which is no longer capable of adapting to the competitive performances for well-being under domination, no longer capable of tolerating the aggressiveness, brutality, and ugliness of the established way of life. The rebellion would then have taken root in the very nature, the quote-unquote biology of the individual, and on these new grounds, the rebels would redefine the objectives and the strategy of the political struggle, in which alone the concrete goals of liberation can be determined. So I want to point out, it's interesting here how he puts biology in quotes, and I thought that's sort of interesting because remember, Marxism views everything as sort of this blank slate, that people are just shaped by their environment. We can mold people into whatever they want. Freud, like I said, gets into issues of trauma, repression, all this. So it's almost like he's sort of downplaying the role of biology and some of these sciences, and I think that's a bad thing, because this is something objectivism gets accused of as well, that they sort of deny certain research into psychology, they deny evolutionary psychology, some of those things. And there have been different interpretations of that. Some people have said when Rand said blank slate, she didn't mean human nature is infinitely malleable. She meant people come into the world not knowing anything, and how you develop is based on how you act. But you're still operating within that framework of IQ, biology, all that. It's an interesting thing, because I find with the left and the right, they both have issues with evolutionary psychology. With the right, it's the religious thing. They don't like the idea that people are controlled by certain biological urges and impulses because they want to say God gave us free will, we can do what we want. With the left, they have this blank slate, we can mold people into what we want, and of course, no, evolutionary psychology proves that's not the case. So they're both sides are attacking it, but for different reasons. So thoughts and comments?
There is something interesting with that, and it's definitely very true. And again, we're also mentioning biology is still like the germ theory. Like, this is one thing I've said with religion. Yeah. The germ theory recognizing germs undoes every religion. Like, pretty much every religion was just trying to in my experience from trying to study multiple religions, trying to understand what germs are, like microscopic life. Like, once we realized germs exist, that explained disease, that explained a lot of other things, and then we start to, now that's just germs. Now all the things we're starting to learn with the human genome and things like that, it's so new, and also existence changing. Now even what we're looking for as life, why would human beings think the being that created the entire universe, why would they imagine in the current religions that those beings look like us, like we're made in their image? Because we had an idea of what we thought of as existence was only Earth. But from what we know about the universe, we can already think of many different ways of existing, of comporting matter that would be far better suited to existing in the universe than humans. Like, the actual locations that we know of that humans can exist is one.
Yeah.
It's Earth. It's this tiny, and we're only on like 10% of that actual planet, the tiny planet. Yet we still somehow think the being that created everything is a human form. No, it's not. So,
because they just use the argument. Well, they use the argument of all this is to test our faith, but it's like you can literally say that about everything. They've said that about dinosaurs. They've said that about space. It's like, it's one of those arguments. I guess it's an unfalsifiability thing. Like, it's true no matter what, and anything you throw, they're just going to say that. So it's like, why bother? Oh.
Yeah. And you see, they were trying to make an understanding. They were trying to come to an understanding of things. I think like when biology was coming, I think there's also been leaps and bounds in what's happening in our knowledge of biology. And I think Marcuse seems to be open enough. He might have some biases and things like that, but he seems to be somebody who would have absorbed some of the advances in biology, and he might have been more convinced. Because I remember my thinking when I was a kid. I was raised Christian, and I remember my first thinking towards what homosexuality was. It was based more on the religious thing. I was like, oh, it's something. I remember thinking like, okay, even if it's biological, like I started accepting some of those things. There is some aspects in that, but at the same point, I was still saying it's still sinful because I was still trying to find a way to wrap my religious thoughts into it, my theological thoughts into it, and saying like, okay, even if I'm not accepting the 10 Commandments, because some of them are just like, don't envy. I'm like, I envy stuff all the time. Envy is part of the things that drives them. I see what somebody wants, and I'm still going to accept that don't steal is a good one. Yeah, I'm going to envy what that person has. Instead of stealing it, I'm going to be like, how can I achieve that and learn from that person? And I do that thing. And that's part of how the world, we envy the safety and security that society has. So we, instead of having the war, we find ways to actually be like that. That's a positive thing I can see from that. So anyway, but I came back to this and was like, okay, with the sins, if every human did that action, would it be positive for humanity? And I would think, okay, that would be something I'd consider sin. If we all started murdering, that would be bad. So that's sinful. If we all started stealing, that would be bad. So that's sinful. If everybody was homosexual, then I was like, okay, that would be bad because there would be no more reproduction, the human race would end. But then you live in societies now where there's artificial insemination. Somebody could be homosexual in practice, like only have attraction to the same sex, but still reproduce with somebody from the opposite sex. And that's something that has been happening historically and still happens now. Even if you want to have the intercourse, you could have intercourse for intercourse's sake. There's homosexual people who act in movies who kiss people, there's the beards and things like that, the kind of situation, because for Hollywood, you have to have those kind of dynamics. So there's things like that. So I got past it. I was like, okay. So then you start understanding, yes, there is actual aspects of actually found science where if you've had X number of brothers before there's something happened biologically, we're starting to understand that raises the chance of you being that. Then evopsych, this kind of things where it's like, okay, the lower you are, the younger you are, maybe it makes sense for you to have less of a sex drive to reproduce, and then the higher people, like they get the partners. And so there's actual reasoning for it. But even if you have a predilection towards it genetically, you still have to have a choice to do it. And we've got to that point where I think most people accept there is a nature aspect, but a nurture aspect as well. If you have the same exact biology that hints you towards it, but then you live in a society where it's a lot more rigid, where you probably be killed if you express your homosexuality, you probably won't explore that to get to the point where you're comfortable to actually live in practice and absorb that part of your life. Yet if you live in some that are more open, you'll do that. So we have that kind of understanding. And I just thinking this recently, like, now that's also something true with things like racism. Like racism in that sense is as natural as homosexuality when it really comes down to it. But the prevalence of it is due to preferences, is due to nurture, due to the cultures and societies we live in. Some societies are a lot more open and welcome of racism. But I think in general now in the West, it's a lot more accepted for you to live as an open homosexual than it is as an open racist. Like, I think that's something we can completely agree on. So, and some of the very nature selective parts about racism are going to slowly and surely be selected out of nurture and nature, because it's just going to be, if you actually truly are racist, it's going to be less a chance that you're actually going to be reproduce both your genes and your ideology, more importantly, to create a society where your racist ideology and way of dealing with reality will make you have enough resources to reproduce more than the people who have moved past that kind of thing. And I think those are things that are kind of just my thoughts on that. I don't know.
well, just to sort of add to what you said, I had 2 points. So that was something I discussed with Adam Patrick as well. I mean, obviously very critical of the intersectional crowd, but also the Marxists. One of the points that he made, which I thought was a good way to explain it, is that they always complain that we oversimplify and that we don't want to have uncomfortable conversations. Like you've probably heard that, where if you question them, they say, "Oh, you feel uncomfortable about this." I guess because you're black, it's different. I mean, I've gotten that a lot, but the thing is, that's the case, as James Lindsay calls it. It's the iron law of woke projection. Number one, they just reduce everything to power struggles between groups. They don't want to delve deeper than that. They want to say, oh, there's a disparity between black and white people. Oh, it's racism, period, end of story. And then if you question it, they get defensive, or they accuse you of being uncomfortable, or there's some weasel way around it. And like, for example, with the illegitimacy thing, I explained this to my brother. There's a point Wilfred Riley makes in his book. He says some people on the left say, oh, the illegitimacy among the blacks in this country, it's a legacy of slavery. Well, there's three problems with that. One, black families were way more stable in the past. In fact, there were some points where the black marriage rate was higher than the white marriage rate. Two, families from West Africa, particularly Nigeria and Ghana, their families are very stable. Same with families from the Caribbean. And number three, illegitimacy has gone up among all groups, including whites. So it doesn't, they don't address any of that. They either say, oh, it's discrimination, or they find a way to sort of inject discrimination into the conversation. But they don't want to have this conversation because that gets into questions of culture, and then what values do those cultures have, and then what outcomes does that lead to, and then differences in intelligence and work ethic. And it's like they accuse us of not wanting to have the uncomfortable conversation, but I think that conversation makes it uncomfortable because it gets into the fact that, look, culture does matter. People are not equal, interchangeable parts of one general group. Their individualism matter, cultures matter, and even these groups are very vague in general and of themselves. But it's like they don't want to delve deeper into it like that. They just want to say, oh, it's just power struggles between groups. So,
yeah. And with that specific thing, this is something that I'm very intrigued. One of the things that intrigued me the most of this Biden's America is the pivoting and focus on Asian Americans, and that's going to explode so many of these narratives. It's going to throw a massive wrench into the works of this. It's super exciting times because like where do they fit in? Like the vice president, she's got supposedly the black part of her makes her unprivileged, but then the Asian part of her, now all of a sudden she's the Asian American president, vice president of the Asian American community need. Does that give her the privilege? And where does the white part of her come in? But just where does it actually come in when they start also seeing that, let alone how whoever they want to refer to as Asians in America do in this supposedly white society? Like you look at the whole situation, if you're supposedly saying they've been experiencing similar levels of oppression and discrimination as blacks, then you look at the family structures in the Asian community, and you just see it's not there. When you look at part of why I don't think they're going to be able to absorb them into this kind of activism thing. A lot of this activism type of thing goes into welfare state, goes into welfare dependency. Yet I don't think there's enough Asians. I think there are certain communities and things like that where they are, like you look in San Francisco and different areas and things like that, like the houses like Section 8 housing where it's like many people, but some of the people are coming in that kind of situation, but will they be enough of a long history of them, enough to become a strong group of Asians, first of all, how do you group Asians together versus Orientals? It's different cultures and things that are very unique and different in that place. And then the strong connection they still have to their motherlands, there's a lot stronger of a connection than Europeans have to their motherlands. Then when most Africans leave Africa, the diaspora, they normally cut ties extreme. Like I know many people who've left who just don't even talk to people back in Kenya anymore. Like don't talk to people back in Africa. Like they're done. But the Japanese people will probably still have connections with people in Japan. The Chinese most definitely, like back and forth and things like that. The Vietnamese and the cultures are still there. And then when they come to the United States of America, they seem to balkanize. I don't know if it's balkanize. They seem to communize,
self-segregate, kind of.
They self-segregate in a lot stronger way than I think any other community really. like the Vietnamese will hang out with the Vietnamese, the Filipinos will hang out with the Filipinos, and they still maintain those Chinatown's one very specific thing. Like they had like little Italies and things like that, or you have certain regions in like the Midwest where it's like, oh, there's a lot of Scandinavian people in here, but it's very intermixed. I don't think there's an equivalent of a Nigeria town, for example. No. In any significant city in the United States of America. Yet you have Chinatown in majority of the places, and it's not just Asian people, it's specifically Chinese people. It's just and then even in New York, there was like a little Korea area, I remember. There was like a Chinatown area.
Koreatown. You live near there, actually. Yeah.
It's like the Japanese area. So the Orientals have their area. Is there an India town? Like, this is the kind of things where it's like...
There actually was a little India for a time. I don't know if it's still around, but there
Okay.
used to be. It's a little unrelated, but there was a little Germany too. But I guess it sort of went defunct and just disappeared. I guess there wasn't like you say with the Europeans. There, I guess historically there was more assimilation. So like there's certain areas like I know where my dad is from, where my grandmother lives in Massachusetts. A lot of Polish people live there. So, like for example, one of our family friends, his parents met at a place called White Eagle Hall, where Polish people would hang out. And if you remember, the old Polish flag had the white eagle on it, so it's a reference to that. But it's like, you know, you still talk to everyone else, you still assimilate. Obviously, the kids learn English, all that. So it's not the segregation like you say. It's more okay. We're sort of proud of our culture, but we get assimilated into the wider American melting pot too.
Yeah, they take on like it was you mentioned earlier. They take what's according to their needs,
Yeah.
yet they still maintain the parts that they like from their culture. And one thing I think some of those cultures are a lot older, and I think that's why I was saying
Yeah.
that the divides before World War, like the thing that really globalized the world was after the World Wars, the East-West divides kind of changed. I think you look at the start of the World War was in Poland, in the West, World War II, and then it ended in Japan with the two bombs being dropped. And my friend was talking about those two cultures seem to be making the best video games and have there's certain things about the way the cultures are. They're strong. Their strong identity of identitarianism, but they're very proud of their nature and they
Yeah.
absorb certain things in a certain way. But there's some parallels between Polish culture and Japanese culture and certain things that you see from those places, especially compared to the neighboring areas in there. And it's kind of interesting those two places come in. But anyway, so I was thinking those are much older cultures, different kind of histories, where they're not going to want to absorb and accept some of these things that the regressives seem to say that everybody should just absorb and accept. They're going to be like, no, that's
Yeah.
not for us. We're not going to do that. I think there's a difference with that. I think when the white people left Europe to come and establish the United States of America, in general, they were leaving Europeanism and leaving those things behind and saying, we're tired of the Europeanism and we want this new thing and start this new country of Americanism and start the American culture. The blacks did ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves. They, of course, had been uprooted from their cultures, sold away by their tribesmen in Ghana, in West Africa, and those areas, and they came on the transatlantic slave trade. So they didn't really have the connections to them, and they developed their own unique cultures here.
Mhm.
But the Asians, they came over. It was more of a migration thing for work and things. So they still
Yeah.
maintained their connections to those cultures. So it wasn't coming here to start a new culture. It was coming here
No.
to establish an outpost of that culture here. But I
Yeah.
don't think Italians were coming to Italy. The original migrants were coming to establish a new Italy in Italy. That wasn't the case. I think they were okay with
Yeah.
saying we're tired of Italy, what Italy has become, and we want to be something new. So I
Well,
think it's going to
Well,
be
I was going
interesting
to
to
say
see what.
with Italy, it was a little more complicated too, because remember, a lot of the immigrants initially were from the South, and Italy has that whole thing with the Northern and Southern Italians not liking each other. And there was even that political cartoon. It showed all these rats running out of Sicily, and that was the North was always wealthier and more prosperous. So it was, well, we're going to stay here. We have it good. The Southerners are like, wait a minute, we're poor. Let's seek out opportunity. So of course the Sicilians came. I mean, obviously people from the North did too, but they said that's why a lot of Italian American food, it's tomatoes and pastas and things like that, because that's the more southern food originally. The northerners, I guess, if they saw a better opportunity or business or other things, they came over later. But I think it was the southerners more initially. So that gets more complicated too.
Yeah, and those
Uh,
cultures are very different. I lived in
yeah,
Italy, I lived in Rome, and then I moved out to Turin. And when I was in Turin, one of my flatmates was a pizzica expert from Sicily, from
yeah,
down south, and he was playing his dialect of Italian so different from the Turin dialect. Like it's almost a
yeah.
different language. Like that's one thing. At least Italy might not be the best example because like although I lived in France too, but not all. I would like to go back and travel around. But some of the places are smaller, and I think geographics also changes things.
Yeah.
And maybe part of Italy having the history of Rome and things like that, and I think that's where the principalities really began. But anyway,
Yeah.
there's very different cultures and things like that. So yeah, I think that's a good thing to point out. With that, it's not they're not all the same. That's also the way I would say like when you talk about Europeans, it's like, oh, the French. I'm like, what does that mean? There's no. Is it really a thing like French? or were some of these ideas brought up during the world wars because there was a reason to unite in that kind of way, and that's why we've had to sort of maintain this artificial state of war, constant war, where nation states make sense, yet now we're living in a globalized world where nation states don't really apply to the reality of the world anymore. So there's kind of things that are concerning. Yeah.
Well, it gets complicated too, because with Europe, it's the whole idea of different tribes, fiefdoms, the different histories. Italy wasn't even a united country, I think, till 1800s. And then whereas America, the idea is it's founded based on ideas and anyone can come here. Now, different regions developed based on who settled where. But like you say, some of them had ties to their old places. Certain things sort of became their own thing. Like I know with Cajun food, Cajun is a bastardization of Acadian who came down from Canada. Creole, of course, the Spanish people who came. So you have native influence, Spanish, French, all this. So it kind of became its own thing too, versus like you say with some of these other things, we're maintaining our culture and that's sort of an outpost in another land, as it were.
Yeah. It's tough. Like the EU can't necessarily match what the United States of America has, in part because of movement between the states in the United States of America is a lot more open and possible than it is within the EU. Like there's very massive differences. Like there are differences between Alabama and Massachusetts, for example, but you can move from Massachusetts to Alabama and be Alabama in one generation. But it's not really that easy to move from Sicily to Turin and be Turinese in one generation, let alone from Sicily to Belgium. Like that's a whole different thing. Yeah. All
right. I'll just read both these paragraphs at once since the second one's kind of short, and it'll wrap up this section. Is such a change in the quote-unquote nature of man conceivable? I believe so, because technical progress has reached a stage in which reality no longer need be defined by the debilitating competition for social survival and advancement. The more these technical capacities outgrow the framework of exploitation within which they continue to be confined and abused, the more they propel the drives and aspirations of men to a point at which the necessities of life cease to demand the aggressive performances of quote-unquote earning a living, and the quote-unquote non-necessary becomes a vital need. This proposition, which is central in Marxian theory, is familiar enough, and the managers and publicists of corporate capitalism are well aware of its meaning. They are prepared to quote-unquote contain its dangerous consequences. The radical opposition also is aware of these prospects, but the critical theory, which is to guide political practice, still lags behind. Marx and Engels refrained from developing concrete concepts of the possible forms of freedom in a socialist society. Today, such restraint no longer seems justified. The growth of the productive force suggests possibilities of human liberty very differently from and beyond those envisaged, I forget that word, at the earlier stage. Moreover, these real possibilities suggest that the gap which separates a free society from the existing societies would be wider and deeply precisely to the degree to which the repressive power and productivity of the latter shape man and his environment in their image and interest. No matter how remote these notions from these notions the rebellion may be, no matter how destructive and self-destructive it may appear, no matter how great the distance between the middle class revolt in the metropolis and the life and death struggle of the wretched of the earth, common to them is the depth of the refusal. It makes them reject the rules of the game that is rigged against them, the ancient strategy of patience and persuasion, the reliance on the goodwill and the establishment, its false and immoral concerns, its cruel affluence. I just wanted to point out here, too, by the way, it's interesting he uses the phrase wretched of the earth, because if you remember in our post-colonial studies, we mentioned Frantz Fanon, who was like a proto-post-colonialist. He was from Martinique, and he wrote about Algeria and other countries. He wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth, and in Repressive Tolerance, in a section, he actually cites Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote the foreword to Fanon's book, to that book. So I thought that was interesting. He used that phrasing in here.
Yeah. That's another thing I think it's good to point out here is the floor is the floor.
Yeah.
State of nature is the floor. State of nature is what we see with gorillas and chimps and what we see on nature channels and things like that. That's state of nature. State of nature is brutal. State of nature doesn't care. Yeah. That's the organic state of existence, is misery and suffering. It's not even misery and suffering. It's indifference and momentum. It's just things go. Nothing stops. This whole idea, like people who have objections to earning a living, how dare, like, why should I have to earn a living? What life form do they think doesn't earn its living?
Yeah.
just because other life forms, because jellyfish don't have like currency, doesn't mean a jellyfish can just like, or maybe jellyfish might not be existing because a jellyfish is like almost a situation where it can just float around and just take in like plankton, and but it still needs to like move around. Like if you just limited the jellyfish to one location of, if you just put it in one box of seawater, it would eventually end up eating up all the plankton in that seawater and die. It would have to move to
Yeah.
somewhere else in order to get more plankton or something. So plants, trees have to somehow head towards, that's where they'll go through concrete, because they have to somehow extend themselves towards the sunlight. They have to earn that sunlight if it's not there. They don't just sit there, and they have to photosynthesize. There's processes going on. We have to breathe. But some of these things are things that we just do without actually thinking or breathing.
Yeah.
Like you don't forget, but that's the thing, like life forms have to earn their living in their own aspect of what earnings is. And this again, this is what I'm saying. Like when people tie earning into just currency, they don't understand how much of an actual boon to society having currency has been. Yet there's still people alive right now who still live in barter trades. If people truly understood this unknown history, they would understand that even before there was currency, people had to do things to earn their living. Do they seriously think that if we just took away all money, took away all society, took away all the advancements that we've had of modern civilizations, there would just be some kind of, like you're talking about, this is the thing, that socialist kumbaya, that heaven kind of idea where they're
Yeah.
just going to like exist and just be okay. Like, where are you going to get the resources to just exist and be okay? You have people making $60,000 from playing video games.
Yeah.
Like, sure, that person has earned that through time. So the floor is the floor. The floor is here. In the past, the highest we were able to get was here. Like the kings, the richest people, the 0.001% of people were here. They were still mired in that mire for majority of society. Now we have a situation where the top people are now here because of all the advances that we've had. But a lot of these other people, there's other people at these levels. These people at the top might fluctuate up and down to this point because of just the achievements that they have. But the people at the bottom are also in general fluctuating like this. It's people in the middle classes are normally fluctuating in the middle, those kind of things. But that whole concept, that whole thing is that has been done in part due to currency, in part of finding more effective and productive and useful ways to earn livings, to make different things out of yourself. So I think that's a frustration people might have. Like, I chose to do this, and
Yeah.
nobody else finds this enough to give me enough things. This can't earn me the life that I think I deserve to have. But that's the decisions you made. And some of the things, not the decisions, some of the things, somebody was completely accurate and said, I'm going to go into like taking care of horses because everybody uses horses. And the Model T came by, and the Model T was able to do the work of 100 horses, and that took it over. And then that
Yeah.
person might have found different things to do, or that person might have lost their living. But it's not from like, that's part of life. But also in a state of nature, somebody could be the most best human being ever and live the most best useful to the society, give everything out, share everything equally, and the lion just eats his face
Yeah.
because that
Yeah.
lion was just like wandering around. Like, that's also state of nature. So
Yeah.
which one would you prefer to live in? And I prefer the current society. But yeah.
Well, to add to what you just said, this is that recurring theme that comes up with the college degrees. Like I brought up gender studies a little while ago. Like people think, oh, you're just picking on it because you find it absurd. Now, obviously, there is a degree of that, but I make the point it's not about what I want or what I find valuable. It's about what the market wants. If you just want to study something that's a hobby and then whatever, it's like it's not sustainable to have everyone do that. And in the current arrangement, okay, your parents pay for it, fine. But should we tax other people and subsidize that? Why? I mean, why? What is the more not just economic, but what's even the moral case to pay to study hobbies? It's okay, like a petroleum engineer makes 90K a year starting off. Obviously, very good money. But I mean, you have to know chemistry, you have to know physics, you have to know math, you have to know all these things. Those are valuable skills. Even with more green energy being used, people we're still using petroleum. It's not going to disappear immediately. So those skills are still valuable. But again, it's about what is the market demand. I mean, I don't think I would have the kind of math skills or I like science, but I'm not so passionate about it where that would be a good career for me. But the point is there are people out there who value that. So it's worth paying a person that. Just saying, I find this interesting, people should pay me. It's ultimately a very narcissistic idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And because this is the thing like I think about, like this video games thing, pretty much anyone, your average person who's talking about they don't have a living wage, if you're listening to this, or if you listen to this, the people who are saying that probably have access to listen to this as well. They can pick up StarCraft.
Yeah.
If you go to like the Steam store, StarCraft costs like $50 or something. StarCraft 2. I think you can get a machine that can run it pretty well, competitive level of well, like for like $2,000. And most people can get some kind of job. You can take out a loan or something where you can do some kind of job where you can save up in a year or so to get that thing. Then just sit in your room, get your rather cheap internet that you have, and put in the time. Then you too
Yeah.
can make $60,000 to just play a video game. Like, what's stopping you?
Yeah.
Like, there's many things stopping you, because some of those things also, like you're saying with like the math thing, like I was talking about, those people are actually using certain calculations where it's like, I like the game, I find it entertaining enough, but I can't imagine myself ever studying the game enough to be
Yeah.
even close to how good these people are at that thing. But that's the decision that they decided to make. Something much simpler. OnlyFans, the OnlyFans rage, where some women go on and they're just like, I was Belle Delphine. She went on and she released a sex tape at the end of the last year.
Uh,
But somebody was talking about the math of it. She had a 35 dollars a month to subscribe to get that sex tape, and she had something like, I think it was something like 40,000 subscribers
wow.
at $35 a month. So even if it was just like a couple of months of that, I don't know the exact number of it. I just heard somebody doing the calculations of it a bit ago, but it was like millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And that's because she started as a meme for some years back, and she was going to the cosplay. And first of all, she has the physicality to be attractive enough to do
Yeah.
these things. Then she got in the access of it, dedicated herself to the bit, built up the fandom and things. But there's many other girls who are physically attractive doing similar things, but for some reason she got into that situation, got herself in that position. But OnlyFans is literally just women going on there and being like, pay me money for pictures of myself just existing.
Yeah.
And some people are making millions off of that.
Yeah.
But doesn't mean I could go on. Doesn't mean none of us, we won't be able to go on and do that. But even your average woman can't just go on and do that.
No.
What kind of socialist society? What would be the socialist Belle Delphine? Where is the space for the socialist like StarCraft 2 players? Where is the space for those people in that existence? I don't know if they exist.
No, and again, I think I made this point in a previous video, and we'll talk about it more in the human action. But it's the whole, like, people just think that people still have sort of that labor theory labor theory of value mindset. Like they see it as, oh, I put effort, it deserves a reward. No, it's about what. It's about the customer value is subjective. It's about what they want. Like people may think, oh, it's stupid she posts those videos and those pictures, but people are willing to pay for it. As long as people are willing to pay, she's going to do it. And it's like it comes down to the consumer and preferences. Like again, the petroleum engineer thing. It's not, yeah, that work is hard. You have to know all those things, but it's the end product. It's the product that you're able to produce that's worth that value, because you can do that. You can bring in how much petroleum refinement, processing, all this stuff, ultimately that could make millions of dollars. So it's worth paying the person that much for that end result. Again, you can sit there and say it's unfair, but again, what value are you providing? And that's the thing. And that's what I like about that company, Praxis. They think a lot in terms of what value do you provide. It's not just, okay, you're here, you're doing work. That doesn't really mean much. Yeah. And the other, sorry, you had something to say? And then the other points some of these things he says in here, like nature, earn a living, non-necessary. I think he's sort of showing his contempt for some of these things, like, oh, those people have to earn a living. Oh, they're buying things that aren't necessary, like we just talked about. Yeah, you may think it's not necessary, but again, it's about the consumer, and that shows his contempt. And then he talks about Marx and Engels and how they would define freedom. And I think it's interesting because that was a criticism Marx had of the utopian socialists, that they predicted exactly what their societies would look like. And Marx, on the one hand, said he was scientific, but he also said, look, I don't know what this future would look like. So it's kind of like both sides of it. It's like, can you really predict the future down to the exact detail? And then is that how it would turn out versus what you want it to be? And then it's like, do any of us really know anyway? No, I would say no.
Yeah. And again, this comes to the sci-fi thing. One of the times I really noticed it was reading Solaris, which is one of the great sci-fi things. It was based, I think it was on Venus or something like this, or they were on some kind of planet, but they were still using records. Like there was an issue a primary issue in the story was due to the fact that they couldn't get the actual record player to the ship that needed to send the message. And I'm like, somehow they could imagine us getting to other planets and having bases on other planets, yet they weren't able to think of a communication system that wouldn't use physical, like, record things. So it's when it comes down to certain ideologies like this, I think when you come to, especially now we're talking to ideologies, when we're talking to those fields, philosophies, there's pre-internet philosophies and then there's post-internet philosophies where there's a world where could Marcuse really think of how different the world would be when you have this way to share actual information and ideas? To actually, like, what would he think of an OnlyFans, for example? Like, would he think that was good, positive, negative? Like, I wonder, would he have a YouTube channel? Would he have what do you think? What would he think of Twitter? Like, would he be like, this is a garbage platform to use, or would he be using it a lot and be like, we can help? It's something to interest because that is really changing. That's why it's hard for me to really take seriously comparisons of history. And I think recently somebody said, instead of saying like history repeats itself, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I think that's a better way to put it. But I think now it's kind of how it's like, we're not going to write Ode to Joy again because of the new technology we have. We have like electronic music, like drum-based stuff with all these machines and things like that, making all these sounds where technically the sound mixing is on a much higher level of it, but it's still sounds. You're still using the same sounds and things that were being used by orchestras and things like that.
Yeah.
But with internet, it's like changing. It's like a whole different thing where it's like, okay, like this is one thing I was thinking with Ode to Joy and things like that. Ode to Joy is in public domain. It's because Beethoven died over 100 years ago and things like that. So it's like, it's now anybody can listen to it. But then it was like, okay, it's public domain, so you can just like, it means you can use it for anything without having to pay royalties to anyone. But at the same point, you used to have to have an orchestra in order to actually play the music.
Yeah.
But now you can technically just get the sheet music, which is what's in public domain, because if the Royal Symphony Orchestra plays it, the Royal Symphony Orchestra owns the rights to that playing of it. But right now, I could somehow get the actual thing and plug it into a computer that matches the actual things digitally and gets the sounds of those things. In the future, I'll probably be able to have robots that can actually literally play the actual sounds and record that. And then every time it's actually played, it's a completely brand new playing that anybody can use. But that would be a different thing. So that's just in music. So what I'm trying to think is this new epoch, the things, it's not even rhyming anymore. It's like we're talking about a different language. We're using different instruments, hearing different things. Like, it's like we're no longer like, we were humans before. It's like now we're earthlings. It's weird. Now we're like Solarians. We're moving outside of just Earth. It's a great time to be alive.
Yeah. All right. That finishes the introduction. We're coming up on 3 hours, though. Do you want to resume this tomorrow? I was going to probably go for a walk or something, so I figured, you know, we can do this in multiple parts. I figured it's because I mean this is pretty long as it is. So
seems like we will. So the listeners, I think it's about 2 hours, over 2 hours. I think we had like 8 minutes before. Okay, so it's 2 hours. So we'll come back and we'll be at biological foundation of socialism. Will be the next section. And we'll pick that up. We'll set to record that. So this one, I'll probably publish this one. I'm going to repost on my channel, Talk I Had with Adam and Patrick. I'm going to repost that today. So this one will probably be up by Saturday. And then probably by Saturday, we would have recorded at least one more part of this. So it's probably, from this first part, it'll probably be like the other parts where we've talked about some of the things so much in these first sections that when it comes up again later on, we probably won't have as many of a digression talking about things. So they might become shorter, but at least 2 more parts, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. So, okay, at least 2 more parts of this. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you out there for listening and spending your precious time and choosing to listen to us. There'll probably also be different clips and sections to get out of this. But anything else you want to say to the peoples?
That's all I have.
Okay, so that's it for now. Stephen, stay on after. As we sign off. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.